IB Nation, college football fans all across the United States and the globe, as we found out with Irish Breakdown fans. We got them all over the place. We are back for another edition of the IB Countdown to Kickoff. That's Sean Stiers. That's Trevor Trowbridge. I'm Brian Driscoll, and we are here to talk about some college football games coming up, fellas. Today, we've got Army versus Navy at 3 o'clock. It's one of my favorite games of the year. We're going to talk about that. And this is one of the best matchups between Army and Navy we've had in a very long time, where both have spent time in the top 25 this season, which is pretty cool. We haven't had that in a long time. And then we're going to obviously preview, after we're done breaking down Army Navy, we're going to then preview the 4 first-round college football playoff games. We're going to talk about all the things that you need to know. We're going to talk about the matchups, going to have some fun with that. And then we're going to make our predictions for those games. And we'll have another preview show. We'll have Bill Bender on Thursday, where Bill will share his thoughts and his previews. But we're going to give ours today when we dive into these 4 games, fellas, because there's 4, I think, very intriguing first-round games. And I know that some of the teams in this conversation are not necessarily sexy teams, but I think there's some very, very good football teams. As I said last week, Sean, I think they got the 12 right based on the automatic bids. Don't know if I agreed with every bit of the seeding, but I think they got the 12 right, and it's going to be, I think, a very fun playoff. So that's what we're going to talk about today, folks. But before we do, final message from Trevor for one of our friends of the show.
Yeah, we got to give a shout out to our friends over at MyBookie. So if you guys are new, make sure you go and sign up with our friends over at MyBookie. When you do, make sure you use promo code IRISH. What that's going to do for you is it's going to double your deposit. So basically that means if you put in $15, MyBookie is going to match that and give you $15 worth of bonus bets, which is really awesome. If you don't know where to get started, next Thursday, try out the MyBookie Risk-Free Thursdays found under the Bet Boosts tab. All that means is any bet that you place on Thursday, if for whatever reason you do not win, they're going to give you your money back, thus risk-free. Also, make sure when you sign up with them, make sure to enroll in their loyalty rewards program. What that's going to do is it's going to reward you and give you extra cash and extra bonuses just for placing down some bets. And if you're at the point in the season, kind of like me, where you're like, man, I need a little break. Need a little break from placing down some bets on sports, be sure to check out the MyBookie Live Casino. Play some blackjack sitting there right down on your couch. So make sure to check out our friends over at MyBookie. They're the sports book that gives you the tools you need to succeed and rewards you for every moment of play.
I mean, we've got college football playoff. We've got the NFL playoffs on the horizon. And, as we said, Army, Navy today. I mean, there's plenty of different places that you can use that. Guys, I did not realize until this morning, this Army, Navy game is not being played in Philly today.
Yeah, I saw that.
That's kind of become the traditional home is Philadelphia. They've moved to Northwest Stadium, which I also didn't realize. When I saw Northwest Stadium, I'm like, what is this, like some little stadium out there? It's where the Washington Commanders play, formerly FedEx Field out there in Landover, Maryland. I saw that they're maybe kind of looking at starting to move this around a little bit. For starters, what do you guys think of that possibility, that maybe the Army-Navy game starts to kind of bop around the country, almost like their own, Shamrock Series type deal?
It's like what Notre Dame does when they play at Navy, right? I mean, I think it's smart. I think it's like, look, play in San Diego, right? Play a game at West Point every now and then. Play a game at, like every 10 years you play 1 or 2 at home, the other team's home venue, but, play at the different places, I mean, I think that makes a ton of sense, especially the ones where, like, it's like when Notre Dame plays Navy, every now and then they'll play when they played in San Diego a few years ago. That was because there's a huge naval base in San Diego, right? It's kind of doing it that way. So I think that'd be pretty cool. Play a game at Yankee Stadium. Play a game. Down south. Let the Southern folks get a sense of it. Play down in Jacksonville, where there's also, I believe, a big. I think there's a naval base in Jacksonville as well. Or those are type of things that I think would be pretty cool, guys, that I would love to see it play. Take it across the country. I know that they're both Northeastern schools, so you don't want to get too far out of that all the time,
right?
But play a game in Santa. Because remember, Sean, when Notre Dame played Army in San Antonio, it was sort of a shout out to Army because they have a big base, an Army base down in San Antonio.
Right.
So doing those type of things I think would be really awesome and would make for a really fun environment because you're going to have a lot of those, you get a lot of those people at the, Army Navy people at that game. So I would be all for that. But did you find out when I sent you the overview for the show? Because I found out when I was putting the overview for the show together.
Well, is that what it was? I was scrolling around this morning and there was an article about it and I was like, oh, okay, kind of click and, see what else. And it's like, oh, and it was basically all about the fact that, it's in Washington, D.C., basically right outside Washington, D.C., Landover, Maryland, and that they're kind of moving around. I saw some people say they played it in Foxborough. I didn't really, that didn't register when I was reading that, but yeah. And anyway, it's kind of cool to kind of take Army Navy on a little barnstorming tour because, like you said, there are plenty of coastal places with military presence that I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, the Army Navy game is one of a kind, and I know we're about to dive into it, but like if you've never really sat down and watched that matchup, it's one of those football games that kind of means a little bit more than just the football game.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I mean, Notre Dame fans are familiar with it because they play Navy every year. They play Army pretty routinely. Sometimes they'll play Air Force. But I think it'd be really cool for other states around the country to have the opportunity to witness that kind of game. I mean, there's a reason why the only football game happening today, I believe, is Army Navy. Or
like here's another one that I don't know why I didn't think of this before, but like you said, they are obviously located on the East Coast, both of them. New York and Maryland, the two service academies. But like for example, right in the middle of the country where I'm from, is Fort Riley, Kansas, right in the middle of Kansas, which is where the Big Red 1, the 1st Infantry Division, is located. And you've also got Fort Leavenworth, which is, not far from Kansas City. So you've got, like a big Army presence right there, so like 2 and 2 together, a place like Arrowhead, it makes a lot of sense, like for kind of like an Army home game, kind of setting potentially. So I think there are just a lot of different things they can do with it. Especially, it just feels like, especially with the two teams being as good as they are this year, there's only more attention and more sort of overall popularity. It gets to be a standalone game. So I think it'd be cool to, just continue to see it in some of these different NFL stadiums, which I think that they could pack for a game like this, regardless of where it is.
I am curious before we get started, what the TV numbers are going to look like, since these are actually two good football teams. That's why I was kind of wishing that Navy would have just won one of those games they lost down the stretch when Blake Horvath was out. If they just could have won one of those games, I think they might have been able to crack into the back of the top 25. But these are, our Navy's the down team at 8-3, and Army's 11-1, and they're the AAC champs. So both of these teams win into November with a chance to play for the league championship. I think it's just a great story, guys.
Yeah. Like Tyler said, yes, obviously I know that Leavenworth is a lot closer to Arrowhead, but Fort Riley is the bigger installation, even, with downsizing and stuff like that. It is still the 1st Infantry Division. It's a colossal base. And like, if you ever drive by I-70, like if you're going from Kansas City out to Denver, I mean, you've probably seen some of the tanks and the helicopters literally parked 200 yards away from I-70, right there. And, there's like Bunker Hill where they've got, like an old cannon in the tank and all that different kind of stuff out there. So there's a huge Army presence, obviously, right? Someone was just saying, I think it was Stephen, that he was stationed at Fort Riley, and Stephen, that was where basically the reason that I'm alive is because my grandfather, who served in World War II, was a career Army guy, and his last post was at Fort Riley. He retired there. And, so my dad went to school nearby in Junction City, Kansas, which sits right outside of Fort Riley. And that's where my mom and dad met and the whole thing, because my, grandpa ended up being stationed there at Fort Riley at the end of his Army career, so.
Good deal. Shout out to you.
Sorry, I thought you had something to say there, Trevor. That's why I shut up there.
No, you're good. It's just cool. I just have a big respect for the military. My grandfather served in Vietnam, and so there's been members of our family that have been in the military. So these games always mean a little bit more to me. So I'm happy that, especially now that it's two really good teams, are getting the recognition of what this game deserves to have. So it's really cool.
Army has won 2 in a row, and this is like, especially when Ken Niumatalolo was there. I mean, Navy dominated this thing for so long. Like they were just getting a little bit better athletes, like at the quarterback position and at those slot back positions. And, like they were just getting a little bit better athlete, and Army was just kind of plugging along, but they have obviously caught up since then. They've won the last 2 and 6 of the last 8 overall. And to me, I mean, we got to see both of these teams this year since Notre Dame got to play both of them. I do feel like the record is representative of which is the better team. Or, Army comes into this game with 1 loss. Navy comes into this game with 3 losses, obviously both of them losing to Notre Dame. So, Brian, I'll start with you. Your thoughts on this specific Army-Navy matchup today?
Well, I mean, when you look at it, Sean, this is like you said, 2 legitimately good football teams that run the triple option, but they're built very differently. And I think that's something that we discussed when we were getting ready to play the show. Navy is still what they've always been, Sean. They're undersized, they're athletic. They're not maybe quite as athletic as they used to be, but they're still an athletic football team. Blake Horvath is a smaller, kind of rangy, athletic guy. He's supposed to be back. He's supposed to be healthy for this game. Washington Post reported that he's going to be back for this game. I know he missed their last game, played a series against Tulane and then got knocked out. He's been banged up ever really since the Notre Dame game. But you get him back. They're a lot more athletic. We talked a lot about this, right? And in the second, like Sean, you talked about the athletes of slot back and fullback and quarterback. I mean, Malcolm Perry was an NFL athlete. Keenan Reynolds was an NFL athlete at quarterback. Yep. But I remember that 2016 team that Notre Dame faced. I'm like, dude, there's 3 or 4 like legit Power 5 type defensive backs playing there for Navy. And then remember, Alohi Gilman transferred in from Navy. So that's the kind of athlete that they're getting. And Army was always kind of that really slow. They were still undersized, but they were also slow. And so they struggled. But what Jeff Monken has really done here, guys, is he's gotten them to be – they're a lot bigger than they used to be. And they're a lot more physical. I mean, their offensive line yesterday just was named the Joe Moore Award winners. And we talked about that going into the game. Like some of you that think this is like, the Army of old or the triple option teams of old, where they're just these big thumpers, big pluggers. Yeah, they are. Or these undersized guys that just play hard. They're not that. They're big thumpers. They're big pluggers. They're 300 pounds across the board. And that's what makes this Army team legit is you can't just bully them the way that you used to when you just had a 30-pound advantage against them across the board. And that's really been the key, guys. And what this season has shown is the triple option for all the different things that you're going to do with it. It is still quarterback driven. And Army's quarterback, for the most part, stayed healthy. He missed 1 game. Blake Horvath got hurt. Go look at Navy's record when Blake Horvath was banged up. Completely different football team. But it's just fun. They're both triple option teams, but they run their offenses very differently, and that makes it a very intriguing matchup. And their philosophy of how to build a team is very different as well. And I think that adds to the intrigue of this matchup.
Yeah, I mean, it's outside of what this game means. This is a really exciting football matchup. You know what I mean? I mean, you have the size and the physicality of Army versus the speed and the athleticism of Navy. You have 2 really good quarterbacks going at it today. Bryson Daly for Army, Blake Horvath for Navy. Notre Dame faced both. So a lot of Notre Dame fans that are going to be tuning in are going to be very familiar with both of these teams. And I think it's going to be one of those, what kind of gives way first, or what's going to be the dominant trait of each team that kind of prevails first? Will it be the more traditional triple option of Army and their strength and their size, or is it going to be the speed and the athleticism of Navy and their ability to push the ball vertically down the field? I'm actually really excited to watch this one today. It's going to be fun to watch, man. I mean, Bryson Daly, Blake Horvath are 2 really fun quarterbacks to watch. It's going to be a good one today.
I mean, honestly, I think I'm more fired up to watch this than probably any of the recent Army-Navy games.
Yeah.
Because usually it's like I'll find it, I'll flip by, and some of it depends on like what the travel schedule is in December and stuff like that as well. And it's like, you flip it over, and it's like, 14-10, like there's not, it's like they find a way, because they're both so familiar with the systems that each other run, one, because they play each other every year. And, as we obviously know, Navy's got a little bit different scheme with more passing and stuff like that this year, but they're both triple option teams,
which they haven't been able to utilize with Horvath out. That's been their problem, right? Is like when that little brief period of time when Bryson Daly was out this year, they were able to put Dwayne Coleman in the game and still run their offense because it's still such a we're running offense. Well, with Navy, if Blake Horvath, they want to be a little bit more balanced, drop back and throw the football. When he was out, their next quarterback wasn't able to do that the same way, and that's kind of what hurt them, which makes it very different, guys. But the other thing too is, I do have a bad feeling that this could be a low-scoring game, just for the reasons that you mentioned, Sean. Nobody wants to control the clock and limit the possessions than Army or Navy. You know what I mean? And
That's
so,
right.
But I'm kind of hoping we have some fun. But the other thing about Army is they have a legitimately really good defense, and that's what doesn't get talked about enough. I mean, Bryson Daly gets a lot of love, rightfully so. He should have. He should be a Heisman finalist. I'm sorry. Like the numbers he put up this year, he should be a Heisman finalist. Just like Malcolm Perry should have been a Heisman finalist the year he rushed for 2,000 yards as an option quarterback. But it is what it is. But he's a great storyline. Kanye Udo, as you mentioned, Trev, is a heck of a fullback. But this defense for Army is legit good, guys. If you actually look at their numbers outside of the Notre Dame game, they have been phenomenal all season. And here's a crazy stat for you, fellas. Notre Dame's 49 points against Navy accounts for 27% of the points they've allowed all season. They allowed in one game to Notre Dame, and they showed they were a pretty good unit the next couple weeks when they were able to keep UTSA in check and then held Tulane, which is the weirdest stat ever, guys. Look at this. They held UTSA to 324 yards on 54 plays. They held Tulane to 324 yards on 54 plays. UTSA ran for 117 yards. Tulane ran for 115 yards. UTSA passed for 207 yards. Tulane passed for 209 yards. I've never seen anything like that before where a defense basically had identical numbers against them in 2 back-to-back weeks. But
that's wild. That's
the thing that makes this Army team a little bit different than some of the past teams we've seen. And it reminds me a lot of those mid-2000 Navy teams, Sean, that were legit top 25 teams.
Right.
Those teams were really good on defense. And that's what separates really the great option, the great service academy teams from the ones that are just, quality, is how good are you on defense? And this Army team is legit good on defense.
All right. So you guys want to make a prediction on this before we start to look toward the playoff picture?
Let's do it.
Let's start with you, Trev.
All right, let's do it. Yeah, I have Army in this one. For a handful of reasons. Offensively, they're relatively similar. Both teams average over 32 points a game, but I think it's going to be a day similar to what you guys talked about. It's going to be a day of selfish football. Nobody's going to want to give it up. Both teams are going to want to eat the time of possession away. But the big differentiating factor for me is Army's defense. Army ranks 7th in the country right now in scoring defense allowed. They allow 15 points a game. 7th in the country. Navy, unfortunately, is at 51st. It's because they had that, the game against Notre Dame where they gave up over 50. They had the game against Tulane where they lost 35-0. So that kind of altered the stats a little bit. Even though they beat Memphis, I think it was like 56-44. So Navy's offense can put up a lot of points, but Army's defense, I think, is what's going to win the day for them. So I have Army beating Navy. I don't really have a score prediction. If I had to come up with one off the top of my head, I'd say 21-13 Army.
Come on now. You got to have a score ready. It's Army-Navy, Trev. Come on now.
21-13.
Part of me, looking at history, Trevor, thinks that that's absolutely where we should go with the score, right? Some kind of 21-13 type of game. But I'm actually gonna go a little bit more than that. I actually think this is going to be a little bit more of a scoring game. I actually think Navy is going to give them a game for a while. Big reason why is against East Carolina, we finally saw Navy's offense start to get back on track. Scored 34 points, could have scored more. As their first game, over 6 yards of play in a game since all the way back against Air Force on October 5th. And they're getting Blake Horvath back, and they've had some time to rest. They were a really beat-up team late in the year. They haven't played a game since November 29th. So I think Navy's going to be a lot more fresh. I think their ability to throw the football is going to allow them to get some chunk plays early. But I think at the end of the day, the power of Army's offense and their ability to make stops on defense is going to be carrying the day. I got Army winning this game as well, but I have a little bit more points. I have it being a 31-27 type of game with Army winning, and it's going to be a little bit more fun to watch than some of the more recent Army-Navy games. That's my prediction. What say you, Sean?
I mean, that's the ballpark that I'm looking at. I think that there's going to be some scoring. I would feel a little bit more confident in Navy if it was Horvath and not Woodson at quarterback in this game. I do feel like they'll be able to score some points. Like, to me, the biggest X factor is just Bryson Daly and his ability, to, like, I was a little bit surprised with the yards that he has, that 36 yards was his longest run of the season going into the Army game, or into the Notre Dame game, obviously, against Army a few weeks ago. But he's still, in terms of 20-plus yard runs, he's the guy who cranks them out, for Army. So, like, I just like the ability of Daly to be able to hit some explosive plays, since that is so much of what Army's offense is based on. And I've got Army winning this one 27-24. I think it's going to be close down to the end. And I'll just say, shout out to those Army uniforms that they're going to be wearing, the throwback to the Battle of the Bulge. And again, I'll go back to my grandpa, Jesse Stiers, my son Jesse is obviously named after my grandpa served there. My wife's grandpa, Joe, served there under Patton in the 3rd Army as well. They were both there at the Battle of the Bulge. So shout out Army, beat Navy today.
Sean, that's awesome you say that. My grandfather, who passed away back in 2013, also served in the Battle of the Bulge. I didn't know that until after he passed away.
Really?
He didn't like to talk about it. I got his service record, and I'd have to pull it up, but he won two medals serving in the Ardennes, which is where the
Battle of the Bulge was fought. Yeah.
He didn't like to talk about it, and he kind of shared with one of my cousin's husbands at the time, kind of put his story down on paper, but he didn't like to talk about it growing up. Like, he had a swastika thing that he had taken from a prisoner of war, just as a reminder of what they were fighting against, the evil they were fighting against. I never knew he had it till after he passed away. He had a lot of different things that he had saved from his time there. And the only thing he ever told me was he was out on a patrol, and he had dropped something. He was carrying some sort of equipment. He had dropped it, and he was down putting it together. And as he was, 2 German soldiers walked by him, didn't see him because he had to go down, and he was able to come up behind him and take him prisoner. Wow. But had he not dropped it and had to bend down,
you
behind
might not
this
be
thing,
here today.
Well, exactly. So it was one of those things, but that's the only story he ever told me from his time in the war. But yeah, he also fought in the Battle of the Bulge. And when he fought in that battle, Sean, now you understand why he maybe didn't like to talk about it, because that was a gruesome. I mean, the whole war was gruesome, but that battle especially was very, very gruesome.
No, it was the same with my grandpa. And I remember, like, he didn't talk about it at all. And I found out when I was young, because I knew that he had served there, and I was always interested in that kind of stuff. And I remember trying to ask him about it once, and he was very short, very curt, and he just basically said that he still has nightmares about the exploding trees, that were all around them. And like, if you've seen Band of Brothers, which, again, like the 101st is the ones specifically that these uniforms are going to honor, the Band of Brothers who were surrounded there, at Bastogne. And like, the first thing I thought of was my grandpa. Like, there's a couple of episodes when they're there where the trees are literally exploding all around them, and it's like, and that's the only thing that my grandpa ever said about it, because he did not want to talk about it at all. Just obviously,
same. So which is why we as a show have so much respect and honor for the people that do that, because their willingness to sacrifice is why we get to do things like this and hide behind a veil of freedom that they protect and they hold up. So we appreciate you. For all of you that are on the show that are still serving, thank you as well. So it's not just our fallen heroes, but also our current ones as well that we want to honor. And this is one of those games that I think does that.
I saw a photo, by the way. I think it was the Joe Moore award-winning Army offensive line with the sweatshirts. They're like the specific, sweatshirts that are tied into this with the, because like the 101st guys had the, like the card logos, the hearts, the spades, the clover, like on the side of their helmets, because it designated, different units that they were in. That's what that would. But they have like the, like the 4, heart, spades, on the clubs on the front of the sweatshirt. And it's a pretty cool looking sweatshirt. And I was thinking I might have to find me one of those, because those are really, really awesome looking.
Did you guys listen to the broadcast during the AAC championship where they were talking about how that week all the Army players that were graduating had gotten their enlistments, and Bryson Daly got the enlistment he wanted, which is infantry. Not even remotely surprised that young man is going into the infantry.
One of my close friends from high school went to West Point, and when they were like, I remember going to his wedding, and we were talking about kind of like the pecking order and stuff like that. Apparently, like everyone at West Point wants infantry, like that's at the top of the list, So like that, it's like there's a pecking order with sort of how you get disseminated after you leave the academy, and the best ones all want the infantry. And I mean, like you said, that makes sense when you look at the way that Bryson plays and leads and everything else.
I want that dude leading us into battle.
Right.
You know what I mean?
That's exactly right.
There's no doubt. There's no doubt.
Yep.
Yeah. We use the word warrior a lot for football stuff, but when you watch those young men, they genuinely are, and that kid genuinely is. So can't wait to watch that game today.
Yeah. I don't see USMA 87 in the chat, but he's a West Point guy, obviously, as well. So shout out to all of them. All right. Well, let's spin forward. We're about a week away from the college football playoff. By this time next week, obviously, Notre Dame's game against Indiana will be done, and we'll talk specifically about that game coming up here in a few minutes. But let's start off with a little bit broader picture. Which of the first round, like the teams that has to play in the first round, which of them, guys, do you think has the best path to get to the national championship game?
I look at it, Trevor. It's like it to me. There's two types of ways of defining the path. Which is the easier path, or which is the path that helps you build while also not being incredibly challenging. And so the first one is, I think, the easiest path. And the easiest path to me to get to the semifinals and potentially a championship, honestly, is this might seem a little bit crazy, but I actually think it's Penn State. I think might have the easiest path. And then my runner-up would be the winner of the Texas-Clemson game, Texas being the one that would have the best chance. And the reason I say Penn State is because, look, they should beat SMU. And then they get Boise in the second round, and I think that's a win. And then they get to play the after Georgia and Notre Dame beat each other up, they get to play that team. And so part of me looks at it and just says, if you take out all of the James Franklin's their head coach, right, and some of that stuff, if you just look at the path, I actually think Penn State might have the easier path, because my initial reaction was Texas. Then I was like, well, but Texas would have to then play Oregon
right
in the semifinals, or Ohio State or Tennessee in the semifinals. And that I don't know if that one's going to be there. I think those teams have a little bit of a tougher path, because you're going to have to potentially beat Ohio State or Oregon at some point in time. In that, I think Penn State probably has the clearest path, because they wouldn't get sort of a team with their talent level until the semis. Everybody else is going to play a team that's somewhat on their level talent-wise in the semifinals or in the quarterfinals, Penn State being the only exception. Look, Ashton Genty's a stud, but the rest of his team is not like Penn State's team. And so that's why my pick, guys, actually, when I first put this together, I was like, okay, it's going to be Texas. It's going to be a quick conversation. But as I really thought through it, guys, I started, boy, I really think it's Penn State has the cleanest path to get into the championship game.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I look at Penn State almost kind of knocking out both of the two scenarios that you talked about. The one that can give you the most experience and help you build throughout the playoffs, and also the easiest path. I think you can make the argument for Penn State for both, because they're going to face two very different teams if they're going to make a run, right? They face SMU, who is very fast. They have a mobile quarterback. They have athletes all across the field on offense and defense. And then if they make it to the quarterfinals, you're going to face a Boise State team that is a very traditional offense. And I know it might sound simple on paper, but I look at it, what Boise State's able to do, similar to what Notre Dame's been able to do this year. You know what I mean? Everybody knows the ball's going to Ashton Genty. Has anybody been able to stop it? No. Same thing with Notre Dame's rushing attack. Everybody knows that Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price are getting the football. That's the focal point of their offense. And so far, nobody's really been able to stop it. So, not only do I think Penn State has the easiest path, I think the games that they're going to play are going to make them a little bit more well-rounded, especially if you factor in the Big Ten championship game where they competed against a very complete offense in Oregon. Obviously Dylan Gabriel and those wide receivers are going to get a lot of the attention, but Jordan James went for like $180, I think, on that defense as well. So it's a very well-rounded offense. So for me, I think Penn State kind of knocks out two of those criteria. I do think it's the easier path. Texas, I think the winner of Texas-Clemson would kind of be the next one, but they will still have to face potentially, one of Oregon, Ohio State, or Tennessee in the semifinals. So I think that's why it's not going to knock out the easiest path for me, but it is one of. But Penn State kind of takes the cake for me on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to disagree, and they have the benefit of getting to play a couple of, like SMU is the 11 seed. They were the team that was on the bubble, and obviously they lost in the ACC championship game. And then Boise State gets the 3 seed because of, where they, because of the fact that they're one of the 4 highest rated conference champions, and not necessarily that they deserve the 3 seed. And then the flip side, I'll just bottom line, Texas, I think, has the easiest path to the semifinal, but it's Penn State to the championship game. I don't need to rehash all the stuff that you guys already did with because you all, hit all the points with Penn State, but we're unanimous on that.
Do we all agree that Texas would be next?
I think so.
Yeah. The other,
like I said, Texas at least to the semifinal,
right?
But they do have to go through Oregon to get there, from there. So
the other thing that I looked at is that's the easiest path. I think the best path is Notre Dame's, because I feel like they are playing a team they should beat in the first round, and I feel like that Georgia game could be the kind of game, like it's going to go one of two ways, Sean. It's going to either wear them out and they're just kind of worn out for the next opponent, whether it's Penn State or Boise. Or it's that game where it's like you slay that big dragon, and now you just have this level of confidence that just, sorry, nobody else is going to come next to us is going to be able to play with us. And we've seen that happen in the past, right? Like when Ohio State beat Bama in 2014, I knew Oregon had zero chance because Ohio State had just kind of slayed that big dragon, and Alabama had already won 3 national titles going into that season, 09, 11, and 12, right? I mean, so they were in the midst of being a power at the time, and Georgia could be that. So that's why I say Notre Dame's path is one where you get to slay that dragon a little bit earlier, a little fresher,
right? And
then you'd have a Penn State team that honestly you should beat in the semifinals, or a Boise State team. That's kind of how I look at it.
And I actually, I had Notre Dame kind of in the, like you said, who is the next one? I had Notre Dame kind of in that next, behind Penn State, just because this is not the same Georgia team that we've seen for the last several years. I mean, we saw that on display. Now, there's still a lot of talent there, but like when you look at Notre Dame's strength and where Georgia has been hurt, like Notre Dame, like this is a Georgia team that Notre Dame should be able to have some success running the ball against. And if Carson Beck and that arm, if he's not healthy and not able to go, then that changes things completely for Georgia. So, yeah. I mean, I'm not saying they're going to be a pushover, but in terms of who I would still rather play this Georgia team than Oregon. And I'm not saying Notre Dame can't beat Oregon, but I would just rather have Georgia, in that matchup, and then potentially Penn State in the semifinal for a chance to go to a championship.
Let somebody else take out Oregon.
Right.
I mean, you know what I mean? I'm with you, Sean.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a potential that Notre Dame's quarterfinal game could be more difficult than their semifinal game, depending on who the draw is.
I think that's very fair.
I mean, like you go and you look, and Notre Dame might have Georgia down south in SEC country in the quarterfinal game, and then they could be playing one of Boise State, SMU, or Penn State in the semifinals. And so for all those, if I were to stack those up against Georgia, especially with Georgia kind of being hot right now after coming off a win in the SEC, I think you could make the argument that the quarterfinals it would be a tougher matchup for Notre Dame. But to Sean's point, that's why I do believe that you could put Notre Dame in that conversation. If you talk about a path to a national championship, you could IU, an in-state team at home to start out. You play Georgia, who, as Sean pointed out, has more flaws than what people are willing to admit. And then again, you're going to play one of Boise State, Penn State, or SMU in the semifinals, and national championship will be up for debate. Right now, I think Oregon has to be the favorite there. But I think if you look at it, anybody on the bottom part of the bracket, you know what I'm saying? Most likely, until proven otherwise, Oregon's going to be the team to beat in the national championship for one of Georgia, Indiana, Penn State.
I think most teams, to your point, most teams on that bottom half of the bracket are feeling good that they don't have, Ohio State, Texas, and Oregon.
Yeah.
Like those are all on those three are all on one side of the bracket.
Yeah.
Everybody on Notre Dame's side of the bracket has to be feeling pretty good about that.
Yeah.
So what about the teams that have the first round bye? Which of them do you think has the best path to the championship game?
Trev, you have a team in mind for this one? Go ahead and take a shot.
I do. I've been thinking about this one, and honestly, I think my answer for this one, despite what I had just talked about, I think it's Georgia. I do. Like, out of all of the buys, because you go and you look at Arizona State, they're going to play one of Texas or Clemson, and Arizona State's story this year has been awesome. But when you look at in terms of matchups, coaching matchups, and all that, I think either Texas or Clemson kind of has the advantage a little bit over Kenny Dillingham. As much as I love Kenny Dillingham, you look at Oregon, and they were another team that I was thinking about, because they're either going to face a team that they had already beat this year, or they're going to face Tennessee, right? So that one is a little bit more even. That 8-9 matchup is always so tough to talk about, because it's in theory supposed to be the closest. Then you look at Boise State. I like Boise State. I like Ashton Jeanty, but they're either going to be facing Penn State or SMU. And Boise State is, for lack of better words, somewhat of a one-trick pony. Nobody's been able to stop Ashton Jeanty, but now it's the playoffs. You're facing a better field of teams than what you would be in the regular season. And then I think about Georgia. And Georgia has right now the advantage from a coaching standpoint over both Indiana and Notre Dame, in that Kirby Smart's just more experienced in these situations. He's won 2 national championships. And then you look at Georgia's path the rest of the way. They're going to face one of Boise State, Penn State, or SMU, hypothetically, if they go on to beat Notre Dame or Indiana. And then from there, who knows? Like, that's why I said, like, I'm probably going to go with Georgia, because Oregon, to me, is right now the favorite to win the national championship, because they haven't lost yet, So the bottom half of the bracket for me was going to be where that easiest path was going to come from. And when I'm weighing my options between Georgia and Boise State, I think it's going to be Georgia.
Sean, my answer depends on who wins the first round. I mean, that's kind of where I'm that's where I'm struggling, because I feel like there's an answer. Like, if Georgia has the best chance at having their toughest opponent knocked out in the first round. If Indiana beats Notre Dame, then I think Georgia has a very clear path to the championship.
Sure.
Like, very clear path. If Notre Dame wins, I have a hard time saying that, because I think Notre Dame is the best team that's playing in the first round. I do. I've said this. I think they should have been the 5 seed. I'm not losing my mind over it, but they should have been the 5 seed. So it kind of part of it depends on that. I think of, like, if Arizona State, if Clemson upsets Texas, so all those type of things. So I'm just going to kind of stick with not knowing who's going to win the first round games. I think that the team that has the cleanest path and the best path to get to the championship game is honestly, of those second round teams, this is going to sound a little nuts. I think it might be Arizona State. And this is going to sound a little nuts, because I think Texas is a team that right now is a very good football team, but they have a kryptonite. Their kryptonite is teams that are physical in the trenches. What's the one thing that we can say for certain that Arizona State is going to be able to do?
Sure.
Play physical football.
Right.
And then you get into the semifinals, like, okay, that's where it kind of gets tough for all of them, right? I mean, it's, so if Boise wins, they got to play what? Notre Dame or Georgia? You know what I mean? And so everybody's going to have a tough second round game, but I still say I think Arizona State has the better matchup in the semifinals against a potential Oregon type of team, maybe Ohio State type of team, than would Penn State, for example, or Boise State should they win their matchup. So I just think that they have the matchup where they're playing a team that is just probably playing the worst football going into the playoff of the first round teams. When you look at how Texas played down the stretch, ugly win over Arkansas, a little bit of an ugly win over A&M, got beat in the SEC title game. They're probably the least hot team going into the playoff right now. And Arizona State might be the hottest team going into the playoffs right now, and they're going to be rested, and just stylistically they match up well against Texas. But the interesting thing is I think the paths are easier for teams in the first round than the teams in the second round, because I think that the two of the four teams that got first round buys are bottom half of the rankings teams that simply got those buys because of the four highest conference champions get a playoff.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting that I think you started off your argument by saying it depends on who wins the first round game. And that's why, like, I was actually looking at Boise State, because if SMU wins that game at Penn State, and then, then you've got SMU Boise State in the second round. And then if Boise wins that game, well, then, I mean, they're only, not that Penn State would have been a pushover, but then you've either got Georgia or Notre Dame, most likely, maybe Indiana, but, one of those three teams in the semifinal to get to the national championship game. So that's why I actually if SMU is able to knock off Penn State, then it would be Boise State for me. I'm still trying to figure out Arizona State, exactly, is this a smoke and mirrors team? How legit is this team? Because they did come through the Big 12, you still have to give them credit for being picked where they were. And when everybody was out here talking about Iowa State and BYU, here comes Arizona State, and they just run past, everybody. They lap everybody and beat both of those teams, ultimately going away. So
but also
I agree.
Have two bad losses.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? This is still the same team that lost to Texas Tech and lost by 10 to Cincinnati. You know what I mean? It's like, are they really that good? And then you watch them play against BYU and Iowa State and Kansas State, and you're like, yeah, they're pretty good. But I say this all the time, Sean, football is a game of matchups.
Yep.
And that's why I look at it. I think Texas is a good football team. It's just who has the best of those teams, who has the best matchup. Because if that first game, if that quarterfinal matchup doesn't work for you, then it really doesn't matter who you're going to play in the semifinals. Oregon's going to have to play Ohio State or Tennessee. I thought that the seeding should have been 5 Notre Dame, 6 Ohio State, 7 Texas, 8 Penn State. That's what I thought the seeding should have been. So in reality, I think Oregon in the second round in the quarters is going to get arguably the 6th seed, the team that should have been the 6th seed. That is also, they had to play and beat by a point on their home field earlier in the season. So I think Oregon's got a really tough second quarterfinal matchup.
Exactly.
Now, they should have a much easier semifinal matchup. But that's the thing is I look at it. I mean, Georgia potentially is going to have a really tough second round quarterfinal matchup against Notre Dame. And then, Boise State's going to be playing Penn State or SMU. I think the one team that has the best chance at matching up well against both teams that could win in the first round is Arizona State. And that's where I came down from, Sean. But then would it shock us if Arizona State's eliminated in the quarterfinals and doesn't want a playoff game? Of course not.
No,
of course not. And that's what I think is going to make this playoff fun, guys, is because what happens in round one is going to have such a huge impact on kind of what happens next. And it's going to make it interesting. And we're going to preview all these games next, but we were joking with Bill Trocchi the other day, and Bill Bender, when he made all of his playoff predictions, literally just went with the favored team in every game. And it's like, it could go that way, but the way the season is played out, I'd be a little shocked if the playoff just kind of plays out where just not the higher seeded team wins all these games, but the favored team wins all these games. So obviously Boise State's going to be the higher seed than Penn State, but we all know that Penn State's going to be favored to win that game. And I have a hard time believing that's going to be true because of just how the season is played out. And the fact that there is no dominant team. There's no 21 Georgia. There's no 20 Bama. There's no 19 LSU. There's no 18 Clemson in this playoff. And I think that's what's going to make it so much fun to watch.
All right. You want to get into some of these games? Playoff games? We're going to go in the order they kick off. So I mean, that means we get Notre Dame, Indiana right away. 8 o'clock next Friday night, ABC. First time a Notre Dame game, home game, has been televised by somebody other than NBC in over 30 years. Notre Dame's a 7.5-point favorite against the Hoosiers from down in the southern part of Indiana. What do you think, Brian?
Well, my first thought on this one, Vince. Sorry, Sean. My first thought on this one, Sean, is I kind of said, Trevor, what was it, about 2 weeks ago, that don't be shocked if they end up putting Notre Dame and Indiana in the playoffs together because of money. Right? Meaning you don't have to spend as much to hop a bunch of players on a bus to drive them 2 hours from Bloomington as you would have to fly.
I do wonder how much that played into the seeding.
I think it did. I think it did a little bit. And coming from a Division III program, that's a lot of what they did. The seedings would be, okay, who's close by? Mm-hmm. It's like, these two OAC teams were always ranked really high, but then they'd always have to play each other in the first round because they're close to each other. But, look, I think this is a very intriguing matchup. This is probably, I think, the second most anticipated game of the first round behind Ohio State and Tennessee. Just looking at it from a national standpoint, not from a Notre Dame standpoint. But I think this is a very intriguing matchup between two teams that on one side of the ball are very similar. And on the other side of the ball could not be more different. And I think that's going to make for an interesting matchup. There's so many storylines, and both of these teams are kind of playing in this moment for the first time, this playoff game type environment. That Notre Dame hasn't been in the playoff under this head football coach. The Alabama or the Indiana head coach has been in this situation before as an assistant at Alabama, but not as a head football coach at this level. But he's also played for a national championship at the FCS level. There's so many different storylines that you can go into, but at the end of the day, this is one of those programs that you have a traditional blue blood against a team that has no football history whatsoever, and they're going to meet and with identical records in what is going to be, I think, arguably the most entertaining of the first round games. Is kind of my first look at what I think about this matchup, guys. But I also think that Notre Dame's the better team, and I think the line of this game is where it should be.
I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree with that at all. What do you think, Trevor?
Yeah, I'm with that. I mean, it's a great storyline, right? Especially for people that have lived in Indiana and have been around both programs and are familiar with both programs. Like I grew up around South Bend, but I mean, for anybody that lives up north, you get it. There's no shortage of IU fans there because at the end of the day, we live in the state of Indiana. Of course, there's going to be IU fans everywhere, right? But I think it's a cool storyline. Maybe not for people that live in California. They might not care about the battle for Indiana, but it's really cool.
A lot of Indy fans out there, baby.
There are a lot of Notre Dame fans out there, as the USC Trojans found out on November 30th. But I think it's going to be a fun matchup. I see it playing out very similar to how Brian talked about. I think it's going to be, what kind of gives way first. IU is going to come out fired up for this, as they should be. Not saying that Notre Dame won't, but I do believe that the team, their fans, like they kind of know that they're playing with house money a little bit. Like they get it. They weren't even supposed to be here. Like they weren't projected to do what they were supposed to do this year, and they did it in emphatic fashion. They went 11-1. Only loss was to Ohio State, which makes this, I think, a lot more interesting. Not, it's not like a Clemson situation where they backdoored themselves into the playoffs and kind of snuck in and nobody thinks they should be here. IU put themselves before the Ohio State game at the number 5 team in the country. They went into that game 10-0. They won 10 straight. We've been really high on Notre Dame for winning 10 straight games, and so IU did that to start their season. So all of those storylines combined, you have on the other side, you have Notre Dame overcoming that really bad loss on September 7th and ripping off 10 straight games themselves to finish out the season. So you have two pretty hot college football teams coming into this matchup. And above all else, I think that it's fitting that the first ever college football playoff game played at a campus in NCAA history in football is at Notre Dame Stadium. Yep. I couldn't imagine it being anywhere else.
Sean, I know we're going to get to the how they got here conversation here in a minute, but Trevor, the thing that you had mentioned about Indiana that makes this an intriguing matchup is the point you made is they know they're playing with house money. There's zero pressure on Indiana going into this game. Zero. They're an over touchdown underdog. Nobody thinks they should have been here to begin with. They're a bunch of group of 5 players that transferred up to the Power 4 level for their final seasons. There's zero pressure on them. All the pressure right now is on Notre Dame. I mean, Notre Dame can't afford. If Indiana loses this game by a field goal, it's a moral victory for the program. I mean, it is. I don't know that Curt Cignetti will look at it that way because of how competitive he is, but big picture, it is. If Notre Dame loses by a field goal, it's
everybody else is going to feel good about it, with the exception
right.
of him and the team.
Right.
Like everyone in IU Nation is going to feel good about it because it is a basketball school. And I mean, it's literally football has been even less than an afterthought forever at Indiana.
You know,
Notre
Dame doesn't view us important enough to schedule. We went to their place, played them down to the wire. That's a win. Notre Dame wins by a field goal. It's like, that's a disappointing win is what a lot of people think. And if Notre Dame loses by a field goal, it's devastating. It's crushing. It's wow. How could you lose to that football team? So all the pressure is on the team from South Bend. I mean, that's where it is. So when you look at these type of games, those things matter. Who's feeling the burden of that moment? How does Indiana handle it? That's going to be the big question. But also, how does Notre Dame handle it? I actually think Notre Dame has handled those type of moments pretty well this season under Marcus Freeman. And you look at how they performed going into the A&M game when there was a lot of pressure on them. USC game, they're playing for a playoff spot. The Army game and all that meant. But this is a different animal now.
Well, and that's the different animal. I'm glad you said that because that's what's been going through my head here for a minute because, Cignetti does have the experience, lost some championship games at the FCS level, but played in those games. He's gone through FCS playoffs, but the exposure now and the attention on this game, especially because they are playing at Notre Dame Stadium, is going to be unlike anything he's ever faced, because let's face it, at the FCS level, it's generally your fan base that really cares, like those games don't even, some of those other games show up on TV, but in terms of like national, like anyone really watching and paying attention, it's not until the very end of the process. But every step of the way, every decision that you make now, and you can say this, really with the exception of the Ohio State game, he's never even had to go through that this year. So, my initial thought was, does Cignetti have an advantage because he's been through these playoff kind of situations? But then again, the other side of it is what I just kind of went through. It's a completely different thing now being at this level and this kind of playoff and this stage than even what he's been through before at James Madison.
The other thing, too, guys, at James Madison, his teams were really talented.
Yeah.
I mean, they were one of the 2 or 3 best rosters in college football. They were Notre Dame. They were Notre Dame in a lot of those matchups when he was at James Madison. So, like, when you look at the year that they went to the national championship game and lost to North Dakota State by 8 points, that was a great North Dakota State team. The only other team they lost to that year was a 7-point loss to West Virginia. And keep in mind, they were an FCS team. They beat ranked Elon. They beat ranked Stony Brook. They beat ranked Villanova. They beat ranked Towson. They beat ranked New Hampshire. They beat ranked Monmouth. They beat ranked Northern Iowa. They beat ranked Weber State. But that's partly because they were always the most talented team on the field. And it's a little bit different for him now.
Yeah.
And that's going to be part of it too, Sean. But like you said, this is a head coach that understands how to prepare a team for a playoff. And it's a different animal when you've got 3-4 games to play than it is when you've got 1 or 2. And I do think that gives him an advantage. Plus, he's also been someone who has coached at this level. I mean, he was an assistant coach and the recruiting coordinator on the Alabama team that won the first title under Saban. So it's not like he's an FCS lifer that's just learning how to be on the stage. This is a guy that has coached. He understands the pressure of playing in this type of moment. He coached in an SEC title game, multiples actually. He's coached on a national championship game. There's a lot less pressure on an assistant coach. 100%, but he understands what the head coach had to do. He was there. You know what I mean? So you know what the moment's like for your players. You know the pressures of getting them ready for that type of moment. And I don't think this game is going to be like that game was, because this is still a first-round game, not a national title game. But I think those things help him. But at the end of the day, Notre Dame's kind of been through some of this stuff as well, right? I mean, getting ready for the Texas A&M game and all the questions they had to answer, getting ready to play Ohio State last year. Can Marcus Freeman get his guys ready to play in this moment? And the unique thing too, guys, is Notre Dame has been in a playoff mindset since September 6th or September 7th. I mean, they've had to be. They were in a we can't lose again mode since the first week of September when they lost to Northern Illinois. And so how does that help them going into this type of environment? That's kind of what we're going to find out.
Yeah. I mean, for the reasons that you just listed out, that's what makes Indiana such a dangerous team, is because they're not hanging their hats on any moral victories. I mean, shoot, Notre Dame had a head coach not too long ago that hung his hat on moral victories. I'm serious. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, Kurt Cignetti could
we all know what you mean.
Oh, yeah. Kurt Cignetti could easily go into this game and be like, yo, we weren't even supposed to be here, guys. Let's give Notre Dame a run for their money. Like, this is a coach that's competitive enough that if he doesn't win this game, he will believe that the better team didn't win that game. And that's a dangerous
100%.
Coach in the playoff, man. That is a dangerous coach in the playoff. And that's
absolutely thinks his team is better than Notre Dame.
Yeah. And he should. Like, it's like not from matchups. You should believe that your team has the best.
As the head coach, he should feel like that.
Well,
yeah.
I don't know. Sometimes I feel like you should have a realistic understanding of who you are, because that should dictate how you prepare your team, not how you prepare your game plan. Right? Like if I think I'm not as good as you, I know sometimes I'm going to have to take some chances that I can't otherwise take. Right? If I know I'm definitely better than you, I may not go for it on fourth down at midfield, because I know you can't move the ball on us and we're the better team, and so I'm going to punt here. So I do think in that regard maybe, but at the same time, I don't think he looks at it. I think sometimes guys that are as arrogant as Kurt Cignetti is, and I mean that in a complimentary fashion, because if he wasn't as arrogant as he was, they would not.
They wouldn't be where they are.
Right.
Yeah.
100%. And they won't have a chance to beat Notre Dame if he prepares his team like, hey guys, they're just better than us, and we're not supposed to be here, and all. They're gonna get rolled. And so he needs to have that mindset. But I get the point you're making, Trevor. I do. I think he genuinely believes that. There's no doubt in my mind, and he's going to prepare his team and call that game.
Look,
and do it as aggressively as he has done every other game.
I mean, he believed it since, what was that, July, when he stepped to the podium and, the Google me comment, I win everywhere I go. And we all kind of laughed and chuckled. It's like, okay, Kurt Cignetti, you're still the head coach at Indiana. Let's kind of control yourself here a little bit. But, look, he's shocked us all, but it starts with the confidence that he has both in himself and his guys. And, look, like you said, he had better athletes than pretty much everyone else when he was at James Madison, and he brought the best ones who wanted to come with him to Indiana. It gave them a chance to play on a bigger stage. And now here they are on the biggest stage in college football coming up next week.
Which is why I loved Marcus Freeman's comment of, well, I Googled him.
And he has one everywhere he's been.
Yeah.
I thought that was great.
Oh, it was awesome.
I still think it's like like the fact that he kept a straight face during that whole thing. It was not like, I'm throwing shade. He was just like, I Googled him. He's won everywhere he's been.
Because
there was no hint of sarcasm to it.
In typical Marcus Freeman fashion, he then continued to break down the team. It's like, so I went and I Googled him, and they are a really good football team. They're athletes. And it was perfect. It was awesome.
So when you look at this matchup, any particulars that you guys want to talk about that you're looking at Notre Dame, Indiana?
Well, I think when you look at this Indiana football team, here's the thing: when you look at kind of where they came from, these two teams are coming from a very similar place, and that also adds into the intrigue of this matchup. In that these teams have not played a lot of close football games this season. And coming into the year, I think Indiana was favored, 16th or 17th in the Big Ten, right? Coming into the season. And not much is expected. Beat Florida International in the opener, who cares? Beat Western Illinois in this NCAA game, who cares? When they beat UCLA by 29 on the road, you started to be like, well, that's interesting. I didn't see that coming. I mean, I don't think UCLA is that good, but boy, they just blew UCLA out on the road. And then they just kept winning and winning and winning. And then you're like, hey, this Nebraska game, this is going to tell us who they really are, because this Nebraska team's, really good. They're 4-1, 5-1, coming into that game. And, everybody's talking about this team is, this could be the upstart. Like Nebraska is the team that everybody predicted could be Indiana, right? That was the team like, hey, they may be 7-0 going into this game against Ohio State, or 6-1 at worst going in this game against Ohio State. And Indiana was like, no, that's going to be us. And that game where they beat Nebraska 56-7, that kind of, I think, woke everybody up to like, hold on a second, this is something different. And then they lose their quarterback in that game, and then beat Washington by 14 the next week. And then it really wasn't, guys, until they played Michigan on November 9th that they played a competitive football game.
Right.
A genuinely competitive football. There's a couple games that were close in the second half, and they pulled away late. Like I think it was the Northwestern game was that way.
Maryland was that
way, but they were in control of that game. They really didn't play a competitive game until that November game, and it's kind of a lot like Notre Dame, where Notre Dame went a long period of time, really from the start of the bye week until the USC game, where they didn't play a competitive football game. I mean, not even like the Louisville game was competitive, even though I don't think Sean, we were up there sitting beside each other for that game. It was never like they're going to lose this game. It was always kind of like, what's the margin going to be?
Right. And I felt like if wherever it was, if Notre Dame gets one more touchdown, this game is over. And they kind of flirted, and it took them a little bit longer to get there.
Right.
But they finally did. Yeah,
right.
You're absolutely right.
And it wasn't until USC, and even in that game, they had a 21-point lead with like a couple minutes left, and then USC went down and scored. Sean's got a cramp. It's not really until that moment that you've kind of looked at it and said, hey, I think this football team has a chance to be really good for Indiana. And Trev, when you look at Notre Dame and how they got here, it's a very similar path post Northern Illinois.
Yeah.
Didn't play a great schedule, not a lot of great teams on there, but they dominated all of those teams, and that's the mark of a good football team. Everybody's like, well, you can't be good if you don't have a good strength of schedule. Well, that's nonsense. You can be good if you play a bad schedule, but you better dominate that schedule. That's exactly what Indiana did, and that's exactly what Notre Dame did to get here.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you go and you dive into what Notre Dame's path was, I'm not going to go too in depth about it because everybody in this chat, us included, we know how it was. You start out great against Texas A&M. Tragedy hits a week later in your home opener. But the fact that Notre Dame was able to rip off 10 straight games, and it's not like games that we had seen in the past, right? It's not like the Duke game from last year where it was really ugly and Notre Dame kind of snuck out a win at the end. Their average margin of victory in those 10 games was 30.7 points, and they scored an average of 44.1 in that 10-game winning streak. So not only in just a short time to come back and rebound from losing to Northern Illinois at home, not only did they come out and beat teams like they should have to go on a 10-game win streak, they were dominating opponents, very similar to what Indiana was doing to start their first, really 9 games of the season until they played against Michigan, right? So you go and you look at that path, and we brought it up earlier. Notre Dame has been playing playoff elimination games since September 8th. You know what I mean? They were on September 14th against Purdue. You lose that game, you're out of the playoffs, no matter what. They could have ripped off 9 straight and looked awesome doing it. You're not getting into the playoffs after dropping back-to-back, right? So because then you're having a conversation of Notre Dame is having to battle back within the top 12, not just from 18th, but most likely from unranked, especially if Purdue's season played out the rest of the way that it did. You know what I'm saying? And Notre Dame's 2 losses is to a MAC school and a team that finished 2-10. So what they were able to do almost immediately afterwards has prepared this team and built them up to where, yes, it's Marcus Freeman's first playoff, but you could make the argument this is his 11th elimination game from the college football playoff. So for those reasons, I think to what you said about Indiana's path to get here and Notre Dame's path to get here, that's what makes this matchup so fun. Yeah. And that's what makes it so intriguing.
There's no doubt. That's when you look at sort of this matchup, Trevor, you start to dive into it and look, we're going to take a deep dive into this particular matchup in this coming week at Irish Breakdown. But just looking at some of the things that are going to factor into this game, look, Indiana, it's strength on strength when you look at the Notre Dame offense against the Indiana defense. And when you win these types of games, it's like, okay, yeah, they know what we want to do. We know what they want to do, but who's going to be better at? Who's going to be better at executing their strength? Is it going to be Indiana's run defense plays better than Notre Dame's rush offense, or is Notre Dame's rush offense going to play better than Indiana's rush defense? That's key number one. And then the second key is whose complementary part of their game is going to play better. So when you look at we'll start with the Notre Dame offense against the Indiana defense, because I think the same story is true on the other side of the ball. Indiana's pass game is dynamic and elite, and Notre Dame's pass secondary and pass defense is outstanding. It's one of the best. Their run defense is good, not great. Indiana's run game is good, not great. So on both sides of the ball, you have these matchups of, like, in Indiana, I know ranks high in pass defense, but I think a lot of that has to do with they played a lot of really bad passing offenses this year, right? And they have a good secondary. That's not meant to take away anything from Indiana. They're a good football team. You were praising the Pons kid yesterday in our show, and he's outstanding. Their two safeties are a really good player.
Yes.
Osprey's a really good player. Farrell's a very good player. This is a good secondary. But when I look at it, this is where it is. It's strength on strength and then good on good. There's no area where either team is weak, but Notre Dame's strength is running the football. Indiana's strength is on defense is stopping the run. Which one of those carries the day? But also, who plays better in that other area? Can Notre Dame do enough throwing the football to take the pressure off their run game and make Indiana play straight up? Or does the pass game struggle allow Indiana to commit more resources to the run game, which could make life a little bit tougher on Notre Dame? That's really what it's going to be, is those for Notre Dame, you're the best part of who you are has to roll. And then the other part is your complementary piece has to be, it's got to be at least good. Especially early in the game. And for Notre Dame, that's going to be the key. And for Indiana, the key is, can you shut down the Notre Dame run game? Notre Dame is much more beatable when you can stop them from running the football. Louisville really committed a lot of resources to stopping the run. And the result was Notre Dame jumped all over them early by throwing the ball over their head. And then every time Notre Dame needed a score, that's exactly what they went back to, attack their aggressiveness, right? So Notre Dame throws the ball, they get the ball down the field, throw over the top for a touchdown to Jaden Greathouse, build a 21-7 lead. Louisville starts coming back, and what do? Next drive, throw a deep ball to Jaden Harrison for a big play, and then run a bootleg, a sprint out screen to Jeremiah Love to take advantage of that for a big play. And they were able to kind of take advantage of that. So, yes, it kept Notre Dame from running the ball for great yards, but it's the reason why they were hit some big plays because of how aggressive Louisville was to play that. Will Indiana be able to do that, or can they beat Notre Dame straight up? I mean, when you watch them play defense, they're bringing guys into the box from all over. Their nickel comes flying down, their safeties come flying down. They'll bring corner fires. They're going to get guys into the box from a lot of different ways, and it creates a lot of issues for defense, for offenses. Can Notre Dame find answers for that? That's going to be a big key to this game. Very big.
Yeah. There's going to be a lot of tendencies that IU does that we're going to break down next week. So I don't want to insert that into this conversation right now. To me, the matchup in the battle that I'm going to be paying the most attention to is going to be the battle on offense and defense inside of the 20-yard line. The red zone is going to be on both sides, but it's two different narratives, right? You look at Notre Dame's defense versus IU's offense. IU's offense has the number 3 ranked red zone offense in the country. And I believe they've had 66 trips to the red zone. They've scored touchdowns on 62 of them. I think they're somewhere around like 93% scoring in the red zone as an offense. Then you look at Notre Dame's defense. They don't give up a whole lot. I think it's either 15 or 17 touchdowns in the red zone. And they have the number 9 overall red zone defense in the country. So if Indiana is able to get the ball inside of the 20, who wins that matchup? But then you look at it on the other side of the field, right? You look at Notre Dame's offense versus IU's red zone defense. Notre Dame's red zone offense right now is 74th in the country. And we've talked a lot before about, field goal kicking is playing a factor in that. They do rank higher than 74th when we're just talking about touchdowns. But then you go through and you look at what Indiana has done. And Indiana on red zone
10th in touchdowns.
Yep.
Notre Dame ranks 10th in touchdowns.
But IU's red zone defense is 65th in the country, and they allow scores 82% of the time. So that matchup in between the 20s is going to be a huge indicator. Like, that is the way that I'm looking at it for this game. That's the hollowed ground. Like, that is that's the war zone that either team has to hypothetically plant their flag on and say, hey, one of the reasons why we won today is because we beat the opponent in the red zone.
Right.
So that to me, on top of everything that you had just listed out, is going to be massive.
Right. When you look at the matchup too, Trevor, Indiana's an interesting team because they have the numbers of a team that you'd expect to be super dominant in the trenches. And they're very good in the trenches, but they're not a typical trench team where they're not like Georgia. They're not super big and long and first-round NFL draft picks. I mean, they play a lot of line games. And if you're Notre Dame, this is a matchup concern for you. I'm watching the Michigan game, and I'm watching Mikhail Kamara slant around and just blow up the run game. They do a lot of that stuff. Those are things that have given Notre Dame a lot of problems this year. So that's the thing that concerns me a little bit too about this matchup from a Notre Dame standpoint is they do things defensively that Notre Dame has had some problems with, but haven't really faced anybody good enough to give them some of those problems. And how they're able to find answers for that. You know, can they find ways to take advantage of that? And that's what good offenses do. When you look at it from the Indiana standpoint, you know, their offense is when their quarterback gets time to throw the football, they're lights out. I mean, they are absolutely lights out. When you look at their quarterback, Curtis Rourke, and the job he has done this season, you know, he's a big reason why they have the number one red zone offense in the country. He just doesn't make mistakes. He doesn't beat himself. He's thrown 27 touchdowns this season, 4 interceptions. They don't throw for a ton of yards passing. They're a super efficient passing team. That's the thing about them. He's completed 74.4% of his passes. He's 9.9 yards per pass attempt, which is really outstanding. And then Taven Jackson this season, when he had to come off the bench and start, only went 6.5 yards per attempt, but he's been better than that when he's come off the bench in some games. But when you look at Curtis Rourke, there's a reason why his number is so much better than Taven Jackson's, because he's a smart, veteran, accurate quarterback that knows where to get the football. And the few times that teams have been able to give him problems this season is when they're able to get pressure on the quarterback.
Yes.
So if you're looking at it from an Indiana standpoint, they have got to find ways to protect the quarterback. If they can protect the quarterback, they're pretty good. The issue that they had against Ohio State, it's not that their receivers were just dominated by Ohio State's DBs, and to a degree there was that. Ohio State's secondary did not allow a lot of free runners. Michigan did allow a lot of free runners early in that game. You know, they bought on double moves, getting beat over the middle on deep end cuts, things like that. But when you look at the Ohio State game, it wasn't so much that the receivers weren't able to get separation. You didn't know if they were able to get separation because the ball was, I mean, the quarterback was getting hit so quickly,
right,
that you just didn't know if they were going to be able to protect the quarterback in that game. And that's the thing is, if they can protect their quarterback, then they'll have some chances to be successful in this game. Protecting the quarterback isn't just about pass pro. It's also about scheme, getting the ball out quickly, running screen game, taking advantage of Notre Dame being an aggressive blitz team. Indiana runs a lot of screens, a lot of very effective screens where they think they can catch you in a blitz, they're going to slip screen you right behind it and try to gash you for a big play. Those are things that you look at, Trevor, and say these are aspects of this matchup that you look at and say which team can again find answers to that part of the matchup. That's a big key in this game. Is Notre Dame's got to be able to pressure the quarterback without being vulnerable to the blitz beaters. Indiana's got to find a way to protect the quarterback. Which one of those two things wins the day?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been saying it all week. There's a direct correlation between the pressures that IU has given up and when Curtis Rourke turns the football over. He threw 2 interceptions against Maryland. He was sacked 3 times. He threw an interception against Michigan and fumbled, right? And their offense put up 20 points. And he was pressured like 11 total times, but it was, 3 sacks, 2 hits on the quarterback, 7 hurries. And then obviously you saw what, you saw what happened against Ohio State. Ohio State was able to rip off 5 sacks against Rourke, and he finished the game 8 of 18 for 68 yards, and they didn't cross the 50-yard line again until their second to last drive of the fourth quarter. So it's all going to be down to if Notre Dame is able to get pressure on the quarterback. It's going to come down to that. So
you talk about they didn't have a lot of pressures, and this is what's so I'm just going to be honest with you. The issues I have with Pro Football Focus is they don't have, like against Michigan, they only had Indiana giving up 14 total pressures, which isn't a lot. It's a higher number, but it's not a ton. But 7 of those resulted in hits on the quarterback. And early on, Michigan wasn't getting to the quarterback. I mean, that double move that they hit, Mason Graham came through late, but Rourke was able to get the ball off and then hit Elijah Sherratt for the touchdown. After that, Michigan started getting home a lot more on the quarterback, and that's when Indiana's offense just shut down. And then in Ohio State, first drive, Indiana's getting the ball out. They're hitting screens. They're running the football. They're doing all those other type of things. And then boom, pressure starts getting to the quarterback, and they're shut down. That's really what it comes down to. Not a lot of teams were able to do that against them, Trevor, at least not for an entire game. Can Notre Dame do that? We'll see.
We'll see. Going to be a big question. Going to be a huge question in terms of the matchup, and I know we're going to dive in more about it next week for sure. So, predictions, Brian. What do you have for this game? Because I'm going to be interested to see what you say.
So, my prediction for this game is I think it's going to be a tight game early. I think it's going to be 14-13, 17-14, 13-10, something like that at halftime. Not sure who's going to have the lead. I think it's going to be a pretty good game early. I think these teams are going to fill each other out. I think Notre Dame's their defense is going to give up a couple plays early. I think whether it's a screen or a double move, I think there's some things they do that against Notre Dame's man defense that make them a little bit vulnerable to maybe some big plays. We've talked about that. And I think the offense is going to probably need a little bit of time to kind of get rolling. But I think coming out of the break, I think this Notre Dame offense starts to find its groove. I think they find some holes, and I think Notre Dame runs away with it early. So my prediction for right now is I do have Notre Dame winning this football game. I have them winning this football game 34-24. A game that's a lot closer in the first half, but I think the defense takes the game over in the second half, and the offense finds its groove, and Notre Dame pulls away from Indiana in the second half and wins by 10.
Yeah, I like that. I see it playing out a little bit similar. I think the defense is going to take over in the second half. For me, I have, and I'll kind of break down my score here in a second, but I see it going relatively similar to the Ohio State game. I don't think the final score is going to be as like Notre Dame's margin isn't going to be as much as Ohio State's. I don't think, but I have the final score being 34-16. I have it being somewhat closer. So I have it being a 14-10 game at halftime, and I think it's going to be very back and forth. But I do think after about the first quarter and a half, Notre Dame will have gotten Indiana's best. I think that's how it's going to play out. And then I think it's just going to be, somewhat of a field goal game in the second half for Indiana. I think they'll make it down to the red zone a couple times. Once they get to the fourth quarter, I think they're going to start going for it on fourth down a little bit more than just settling for field goals because of the margin of, what the score is at that point in time. So I think in the fourth quarter, they're held out of the end zone. I think Notre Dame's defense kind of settles in because they had seen everything that Indiana's offense is going to throw at them. And then for Notre Dame on offense, I just see it being a consistent game for them. I don't think that in the second half they really open it up and blow the doors off. I think they just kind of run their offense, So I have final score being 34-16. I just think that Notre Dame's defense is going to win the day in the second half and force 2 field goals in the third quarter for Indiana. Final score being 34-16.
Thank you for bearing with me. I had a cramp about the size of a softball in my left hamstring, and I was walking. I found a heating pad. Finally, I'm able to sit on the heating pad. I was trying to stand and hold it, and it kept recurring. So I went and got some sports drink, trying to get a little potassium, a little sodium in me, see what happens. Things are good right now, but I mean, you guys obviously nailed the most important points. I did want to make one thing that I looked at. There are 5 categories that tend to be good predictors of, are you going to be a national championship caliber team? And they are run offense, pass efficiency offense, run defense, total defense, and turnover margin. Both of these teams are pretty good in all of those categories. The only 2 where Notre Dame is not elite are pass efficiency offense and run defense. They're 38th in pass efficiency offense. They're 51st in run defense. Now, I think if you look at both of those, categories, like we pointed out on our show last week, the pass efficiency offense, they rank 38th, which is not horrible. It's not elite, but they're about 15 to 16, 17 spots higher since the Northern Illinois game. So they're still, from a pass efficiency standpoint, really good. Run defense, they're 51st, but they also had to play the 2 service academies. So, I mean, 500 yards combined in those 2 games,
Yeah.
because anyone is going to give up yards to those 2 teams, especially if you have to play both of them.
We broke this down. Was it Thursday, Trev?
Yeah,
If you,
when we talked about
if you look at games against Power 5 teams only, Notre Dame ranks 20th in rush defense.
There you go.
So you not only take out Army Navy, but then you'd also take out Northern Illinois, which is one of their worst games of the season as well, in Miami of Ohio, which was a very good rushing performance statistically. So they kind of balance each other out. They rank 20th, right? And the reason I did it this year, I don't normally do it where I take out the one option team they play, Sean. But my point this year was you held Navy like 160 something below their season, or I mean like 60 something below their season average, and you held Army over 100 yards below their season average, and still gave up over 200 yards in each of those games. That's really skewing your overall data, right? And so those are things that we looked at. Now, they have had bad performances. Obviously, the USC game wasn't a very good performance. But again, it was another game where it was better than the 190 they gave up, because they had back-to-back 20-plus yard runs on the final drive when Notre Dame was basically going to go just let them go down the field and score, right? So they've been a little bit up and down, but when you do put the context of what have they done against Power 5 teams, Notre Dame's run defense looks a lot better.
And I would also say that there have been some games where, they were more focused on making sure they weren't giving up explosive pass plays, and they were willing to concede, some runs along the way. So, whatever you want to make of it, there's still a solid run defense. Like to your point, they're not horrible. And, again, like in most of the other departments, they are elite. I mean, they are tied for second in the nation in turnover margin, as an example. They're 9th in total defense. They're 10th in rush offense. So I think the match, and to Indiana's credit, they're pretty good in a lot of these categories as well. But I think that at the end of the day, like Trevor said, it plays out like Ohio State. I agree with that. Like to some extent, somewhat similar to Texas A&M. I don't think it maybe is as close as the Texas A&M game in the fourth quarter, but like Ohio State, the Ohio State-Indiana matchup, obviously. I think Indiana will have some success offensively early, because that's typically what happens against Notre Dame. But the question is, how are they going to respond once Al Golden and company knock them off script? Because I think that, they're not going to be able to just stay on a flat script the whole game. And that's where I do think, Notre Dame's not just going to run all over Indiana, but I think that as the game progresses, these are both really well-coached teams, but Notre Dame is the more talented, really well-coached team. And, again, like similar to Ohio State, Notre Dame and similar to Indiana's matchup with Ohio State and similar to Notre Dame's matchup with Texas A&M, Notre Dame has the ability to make more explosive plays on offense. And I think that will be a big factor as this game wears on. And I've got Notre Dame winning 27-17.
I think explosive plays will be a big part of it, Sean. Who makes them and who doesn't let them happen, right? I mean, we talked about that with the Notre Dame defense, Sean. It's big plays were one of our 3 keys that Trevor and I talked about, right? You got to make them, and you got to not let them have them. And I think that's big, because if Indiana is going to be in this game, it's not because they're methodically moving the ball up and down the field. It's because they're going to chunk play you to death, and that's going to be the way that they're going to beat you. So, and
that's what again, like this is an expanded playoff, but that has also been a huge factor once you get into like the when it's down to 4, obviously, but that's going to be a huge factor in all of these games. Which teams have the best chance to make the most explosive plays?
Right.
I think, because like you can talk about turnover margin and all those things. That's obviously going to be important all the time. But I think that Notre Dame has got the ability to make explosive plays on offense, and I think that they're better athletes, and they're better able to get to the perimeters better defensively to keep, Indiana from making a lot of those kind of plays.
I think that's what a lot of national people are missing about this Notre Dame defense, is how fast it is.
Right.
That's what I think people don't. So a lot of people that aren't, you hear a lot SEC fans, Indiana fans, well, Notre Dame's defense is overrated. Okay. All right. Like there was a guy that who I like. He's a smart football guy, but he broke down the Notre Dame IU game and he's just ripping the Notre Dame defense apart. And I asked him, I said, "Is that the only game you watched? Was the Notre Dame USC game?" He's like, "Yeah." And I was like, "Well, you didn't break down but he didn't break down the Ohio State Indiana game as the counter. He used a different game where Indiana played well." And it's like, well, if that's it's like I've said to Notre Dame fans,
break down the best team they played against.
You can't look at Indiana and say, well, they struggled against Ohio State, so they're going to struggle against Notre Dame because it was their worst game. And you also shouldn't look at USC and say, well, Notre Dame struggled there, so they're going to struggle against Indiana. You look at them at the entirety of their season, and that's why I think is the best way to do it. But even then, you still look at it and say, Indiana played a soft schedule. Notre Dame didn't play a very hard schedule, but Notre Dame certainly had a much tougher schedule than what Indiana faced, and Notre Dame was every bit as dominant, if not more so, than what Indiana was. And Trev, you and I have pointed that out. When you break down these games and you look at the statistics from these two games, and I think that's what a lot of people are missing. And it is funny to listen to some of the Indiana. Trev and I were talking about this yesterday, Sean. I was actually kind of thinking this is going to be a fun little build up to the game, and Indiana fans were just going to be excited to be here and all that kind of stuff. I have been really shocked.
It's
really
typical Indiana arrogance is what it is.
How much they're like, this team sucks. And like, I had a guy, I listened to, it was one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard in my life. But this one Indiana podcast, they were talking about how Notre Dame struggled with Purdue.
I saw that. They were up 42-0 at halftime.
Exactly.
Where was the struggle? They took everybody out at halftime.
Exactly. And it's
half of their offensive line was out because of injuries.
They haven't played anyone as good as Michigan, and I'm like, what planet are you on? You know what I mean? It's like,
well, see, and that's Indiana keeps wanting to give Michigan credit for being the defending national champion, even though they're a 7-5 team this year. They're not that team. They're completely different. It's just, I give you credit. You're Indiana. You beat Michigan. That still means something if you're Indiana. Really, anyone across the Big Ten. Just ask Ryan Day. Right. But you can't hang your hat on that just because you beat Michigan. I'm sorry.
Right. And the assumption that, Michigan is just better than this team or that team or the other thing. It is kind of interesting, but I look at it like this. When you look at Notre Dame and you look at what they've done this season, Indiana has a slightly bigger margin for a victory when you look at just their overall statistics. But a big chunk of that was because they beat an FCS team 77-13. You take that out of the way, and Notre Dame has a significantly better margin for victory. Notre Dame has a 26.2 margin of victory on the season, and Indiana is slightly less than that. So it's like if you use any kind of context whatsoever in this discussion, you're going to realize that Notre Dame has been a very dominant team. Indiana's been a very dominant team. And it's going to be a heck of a football game. That's the way I look at it. And I have a lot of respect for what Indiana's done. I'm not going to do what the Indiana fans are doing and say, Indiana sucks. They didn't beat anybody. Because the mark of a good team is you can't determine your schedule.
Exactly.
Right? But you can control what you do to that schedule. And one of the things I liked about this Indiana team is that they had that beat down against Ohio State, and they bounced back the next week and absolutely obliterated Purdue. Ran the score up a little bit, but it's still 28-0 at halftime. Right? And so I give them a lot of credit for that. I think Indiana is deserved a spot in the playoff. Trevor, I've been arguing this for a month. I said, look, even if they lose to Ohio State, I think they should be in as long as they continue to handle business, and they did. But I think this Notre Dame team is a different caliber team than what they've really faced. Because if we're being honest about it, and you can say whatever you want, this Notre Dame offense all season has been better than Ohio State's.
Yeah,
and I don't think and Ohio State fans aren't going to like that, but that's
been much more consistent anyway.
Exactly,
yeah.
That's just a fact, especially in the last 2 months. Notre Dame has been a better offense. And so I believe Ohio State ranks higher in yards per game. But we've talked about this. Ohio State ranks 36th in yards per game. Notre Dame ranks 40th in yards per game. But when you look at it, their yards per play is almost identical. It's 6.8, 6.7. And Notre Dame has faced a tougher schedule, which is why Notre Dame's offense ranks where it does from an efficiency standpoint. So I just think it's it's certainly playing better going into the postseason. There's no doubt about that because Ohio State's offense has not played all that well going into the postseason. They scored 38 points against Indiana. They had a punt return for a touchdown and a 7-yard touchdown drive that came off of another a ball that went over the punter's head, right? Or no, did he And went over his head, right? Am I remembering that correctly? Went over his head?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, but they still scored 24. But I don't think people understand how good this Notre Dame football team has been offensively the last two months. They're not scoring 45 points a game the last 2 months by accident.
Yeah. They're not squeaking out wins.
Right. And this isn't a shot at Ohio State, for the record. People know I'm very high on this Ohio State team in a lot of different ways. It's just to point out that there's this misconception about Notre Dame's offense based on what people saw against Northern Illinois. That's not that team is long dead. This is a much different animal right now.
I concur. You want to move on to one of the other games? All right. How about number 6 Penn State against number 11 SMU? It's the noon game, Saturday afternoon at Penn State. The Nittany Lions an 8.5-point favorite. Trevor, how'd Penn State get here?
Yeah, I mean, it was a weird journey for Penn State. You know, they started out the season 7-0, but they had some close calls, right? Like they beat Bowling Green at home by a touchdown. They went to overtime against USC in the Coliseum. They ended up winning that game 33-30. And then they lost to Ohio State in the first week of November, 20-13. And there were a lot of people talking about, well, Penn State still deserve it. They only lost by a touchdown. Well, if you watch the game, similar to how we talked about some of the Indiana scores and some of the Notre Dame scores, that game was not as close as what 20-13 indicated. They didn't score an offensive touchdown. Their only touchdown of the day came on a pick six. And, you know, so there was a lot of question marks around how good is Penn State. Their best win of the season is still to this point a 21-7 win over Illinois at home. So, you know, going into the last week of the season, there was, you know, Penn State's going to make the playoffs. We just don't know where they're going to fall. Everybody was gearing up for that Ohio State-Oregon rematch, in the Big Ten championship game. Unfortunately for our Buckeye friends and for Ryan Day, you know, they dropped the game to Michigan in an ugly fashion at home the last week of the season, which enter Penn State. Penn State ended up taking on Oregon in Indianapolis for the Big Ten championship game. So it's kind of funny. We were talking about that game for the IB countdown to kickoff, and we were saying, you know what, if this turns into a shootout game, Penn State might lose by, 20. It's going to get really ugly. And to be honest with you, Penn State showed me a little bit of something in that game. It was never going to be close. It was always like Oregon kind of held that 14 point.
They took their foot off the gas defensively.
Yeah. Well, they took their foot off the gas defensively, 1, and 2, it was kind of that, Oregon was up by 14 and then Penn State would score and make it, 7 or 8. And then Oregon would score again and then Penn State would score it. So that extra 7 points was something that Penn State wasn't able to overcome. But I will say, I just didn't think that Penn State had it in them to score 37 points, especially not on that stage. You enter all of the things that everybody says about James Franklin, and he can't win or get his team ready for big games. Now, he did not win, but I do think that outside of that 2016 Rose Bowl game, this is the best game that he's coached in a big moment. So I think it's a testament to them. I'm not going to call them like a hot team going into the playoffs, but I even said, depending on who Penn State draws in the first round, I think they lose because I just don't think their offense is there. They have a good front seven on defense, but offensively, for whatever, and now obviously it's easier said than done because you can't just say, well, just stop Tyler Warren, because no team has been able to do that. But they showed that they could use their running backs in different ways. Katron Allen and Nicholas Singleton are 2 dynamic running backs out of the backfield. So, for Penn State's journey, that's kind of how they got here. They are the number 6 seed. They got a home bid, but it is interesting looking at it, being that the 2 best teams that they played, they lost to. And the 3rd best team, they beat by 14, but it was a very game. It was really boring. It kind of reminded me of the Texas A&M Texas game. It was one of those. But end of the day, they still won. So all in all, that's how Penn State got to where they're at now.
Brian, how about the upstart Mustangs from Southern Methodist?
SMU got here, guys, primarily because Rhett Lashley had the guts to do something that a lot of coaches don't have the guts to do, which is to bench a proven, productive quarterback that led you to 11 wins the year before in Preston Stone. This is a kid Trevor, that threw for almost 3,200 yards the year before, 28 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. Had some good moments against some good teams that they played last year, missed the last 2 games of the regular season, came into the season as the starter, struggled a little bit against Nevada. They go out and blow out Houston Christian, and there started to be a little bit of quarterback controversy because, Kevin Jennings had played well down the stretch for them when Preston Stone had gotten hurt the year before. He brought a little bit of a different element, and honestly, their offense just wasn't really cruising to start the season. And so they made the decision during the BYU game, a game they lost 18-15. They made the decision to turn the keys over to Kevin Jennings, who was a completely different type of quarterback. Didn't work that game. They went out and lost to Nevada in that game. Preston Stone only went 2 for 4, played, I think, the first couple series, and they were rotating, and I thought that was a mistake, and that cost him that game. But instead of continuing to do that whole rotating quarterback things, he made the decision to turn the keys over to Kevin Jennings, and they were never the same team after that. Went out there next game. They had a bye week after that BYU loss. Went out there next game, hung 66 points on TCU that next week. Then they blew out Florida State, went on the road and beat a good Louisville team. I think Louisville's one of the more underrated teams in the country, if you ask me, because if you look at they had that terrible loss to Stanford, which is just completely given their entire season a black eye. But their other 3 losses were 1-score touchdown games to Notre Dame, Miami, and SMU. And they really controlled that game in a similar fashion to the way Notre Dame controlled that game at Louisville, and got that win. Went out and blew out Stanford, battled Duke to overtime. A 9-3 Duke team won that game in overtime. Then come back the next week, blow out Pitt, beat Boston College, and that's, guys, when I started to think SMU's wearing down a little bit. Was you gave up you had the struggle against Duke. You did jump all over Pitt, but they scored a couple late. You didn't look great beating BC at home. And then that next week they went down over to Virginia. I'm like, it's an East Coast trip. I don't know how, does SMU have the depth to really finish the way they need to earn a playoff berth? And then they blew Virginia out, and then they blew Cal out. Nobody else blew Cal out this year. Cal was a competitive football team all year. We saw them. They had Miami down 3 scores and should have won late if not for the officiating crew, and they got that done. So they go in the ACC title game, and Trevor, it was exactly how you called it. The game played out, which was the moment was too big for SMU early, and they fell behind big. You fumble your first drive of the game. Clemson goes and scores in the short field. You punt on your second drive. They get a nice long punt return, and then you get a 15-yard penalty to tack onto that. 2 short scoring drives, 14-0. It's like, well, that's all she wrote. And there was at one point in time where we were texting Trev, and I was like, well, I'm turning that game off, and it was 31-14. Then I'm watching the Oregon Penn State game, and they're like, they show a highlight of that game where SMU had just scored to make it 31-24, and they're like, SMU has the ball back. And I'm like, uh-oh. And I flip it back over, and I went back and rewatched that game, and you're just like, the second half version of what we saw in that game, really the last quarter and a half, is what we saw all year. So now the question is, fellas, did that game give them sort of the big game experience they need to go to Happy Valley, to go to Penn State and play their game? Or is there still a little bit of we're just not quite ready for that moment type of scenario? That's really going to be the key. And I think that of all the teams that are playing, this is the team that could most be impacted by the weather, because they're a team built on speed. And if it's cold and snowy and windy, that could really impact SMU more than Penn State, because Penn State can just kind of play big boy football a little bit.
Yeah.
And that's the intriguing part. But this is a team that showed themselves to be a legitimate Power 4 football team. They didn't thrive off beating up a bunch of nobodies. Their ACC schedule wasn't brutal, but the good teams they did play, the 3 good teams they played in the ACC this year, 2 of them they had on the road. At Louisville they won, at Duke they won, and then of course the one team they had at home, Pitt, they blew out. So this is a good football team, and I think this is going to be a much more intriguing, competitive matchup than I think maybe a lot of national people think, who still don't give SMU a lot of respect as a football program.
And I mean, that's where I'm trying to figure it out, because of what you're talking about. And like I was talking earlier about the ability to make explosive plays. And like when I look at the 2 offenses, that's a huge edge. SMU, they do have a better chance to make more explosive plays, but they are coming from Dallas, to Beaver Stadium, to Penn State, Happy Valley, the whole thing. It's going to be a lot colder than they're used to. Checkmark Penn State. And just the fact that, like, Penn State does not have, that's what I like the least about Penn State of all these teams is they just, I don't feel like they've got that kind of athlete on the offensive side of the ball, as specific to this matchup with SMU, but they've got the better defense as well.
Right.
Much better defense.
There's only one athlete on Penn State's offense that I would consider dynamic, and that's Nicholas Singleton, who half the season they've struggled to figure out how to use him.
Right.
They did against Oregon, and look what happened. Lo and behold, they finally say, hey, let's make this game plan a lot about Nicholas Singleton, and lo and behold, Nicholas Singleton goes off. That's one of those things where you look at it and say, is that something that finally the light goes off a little bit for Andy Kotelnicki? Finally got it right, Trev. Finally got his first name right. Sean, for some reason, I've been calling him Chris. I keep calling him Chris. I don't know why. I don't even know where that comes from. There's not like a Chris Kotelnicki that's
all right.
Right?
Apparently, I called James Rendell Matt Rendell for half the season because I know a guy named Matt Rendell, and it was just stuck in my head. But
it's like I look at it all year, and Singleton has 200-yard games start the season, goes for 81 against Kent State, 94 against Illinois. Then he gets hurt, misses the UCLA game, and they just kind of wrote him off of the offense for the rest of the year. And then the last couple games, they finally ramped him back up a little bit. He had 10 carries for 105 yards, rushing against Oregon. He also had 4 catches for 43 yards and a touchdown against Oregon. And you're like, hey, finally, you're getting this really dynamic athlete back involved, Sean, because if they don't make him a focal point, Tyler Warren's a heck of a player, but they just overall lack the kind of dynamic athlete on both sides of the ball to really keep up with a team like this, which is why I do think the weather could be such a big factor. And that's honestly what killed them against Oregon, because every time they started to claw back into the game, Oregon would just go right back down and score with a big play. And can SMU find those same answers? I think they can if the conditions don't limit their ability to throw the football down the field. Because the one thing I think a lot of people saw about SMU in that game against Clemson is they have legit athletes on both sides of the ball, especially on offense. And the other thing that makes this game really intriguing, fellas, is because of all the issues that now keep in mind in that Clemson-Penn State game or that Clemson-SMU game, we did talk about this. Clemson had some fortunate, I don't say fortunate breaks because I think they made their breaks. They forced the fumble. It wasn't, they didn't, it wasn't an accident that the kid commits a penalty, but they did catch a couple early opportunities where they didn't have to score a whole lot on short drives, right? They only had a couple really long scoring drives. They had scoring drives in this game of 33, 28, 58, 17 yards. They had one drive or 2 drives that went over 50 yards. That was a touchdown drive in the first quarter that went 75, and then the 58-yard drive. I mean, even their game-winning drive only went 17 yards because of, again, another special teams mistake by SMU. But what we saw in that game is their run defense is legit. And that's going to be the interesting aspect of this game. And I don't think a lot of people realize how good their rush defense is. In the last 3 games against Virginia, Cal, and Clemson, they gave up 65, 95, and 64 yards rushing. They held Duke to 98 yards rushing. They held Stanford to 33 yards rushing. They held Florida State to 63 yards rushing, TCU to 65 yards rushing. They've only given up over 150 yards rushing all season in one game, and that was to Boston College. And that was it. So can Penn State Penn State's going to have to find a way to run the football, because if the conditions are bad enough to keep SMU from throwing the ball, they're also going to affect Penn State's ability to throw the football. Although Drew Aller has a pretty strong arm, he might be able to kind of throw through the wind a little bit. But they're going to need to be able to find a way to run the football, and teams have not had an easy time running the football on SMU this year. I think that's going to be a very important part of this matchup is can Penn State establish some level of balance offensively to allow them, because if it's just stop the run and stop Tyler Warren, if they're able to do one of those 2 things, then they're going to have a chance to win this game because they have the advantage against the Penn State defense from a speed standpoint. Trev, Sean, that's exactly what Trev and I talked about last week in our preview of that game, is that Penn State's back into their defense. This is not a typical Penn State secondary. With the high-level athletes we've seen, you can beat this secondary if you have speed. Oregon had it. SMU has it. And that's going to be a key part of this for the Mustangs.
Yeah, I think one aspect of this matchup that not enough people are talking about is, everybody's talking about, well, SMU kind of had their, lights are too bright moment now that they've had the experience from the ACC championship game. Is that going to help them against Penn State? I think another aspect of this game that makes this matchup more interesting than what people are giving it credit for is SMU from a speed and athleticism standpoint is comparable to Oregon's. So in back-to-back games, Penn State is facing two teams with very dynamic athletes. They play with a lot of speed, which I think could also play a factor. Now, on one hand, you're going to have to stop it. Like just seeing it once and allowing 45 points doesn't mean, all right, now we've seen it, so now we're going to hold SMU to 10. Like I don't see it being that way either. But it's going to be interesting to see how each of those are handled, right? SMU kind of had their spotlight moment, and the lights were a little bit too bright. Penn State had their moment of, hey, you're going up against a really fast football team. How can you do? And they weren't able to handle that either. So, yes, I think elements are going to play a factor. I think this is going to be a much closer game than what people are giving it credit for, because I think they're looking at the names. Oh, well, Penn State's 10-2 in the Big Ten every year. And, I remember when SMU got the death penalty. And I think those are the two things that people are taking away from this game. And this
is not 40 years ago. Yeah,
right.
No.
Right.
So
that's what most people know about SMU is I watched the 30 for 30. Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? Which Notre Dame also made an appearance in that one as well. If you guys watched that with the 89 game.
Yeah.
Where
that's right.
That's right. Yeah.
That's exactly right. All right. Well, let's go ahead and pick this game. Who wants to go first? Trevor.
So this game, I think it's going to be, like I said, it's going to be closer than what people think. I do have Penn State winning. I have Penn State winning 31-28. I think it's going to be really, really close. I do. And SMU, I don't think this is going to be a moment where the lights are too bright. I just think from top to bottom, I think Penn State has the more experienced roster. Like that's kind of what I attribute it to. I'm really high on Rhett Lashley. I'm higher on him and his potential and his ceiling more than James Franklin's. But I think it's going to come down to James Franklin, just for a lack of better words, has more experience coaching in these games, albeit he hasn't had more success in these kind of games in comparison to other coaches in the playoff. But Penn State being at home, I think, is going to play a factor. I think the weather is also going to play a factor because it's going to take away from what SMU likes to do best. Mm-hmm. I think they're still going to find ways to put up points. I think Penn State's going to give up some big plays early, but I think it's going to be one of those where I don't know if SMU will ever have the lead. Like, I don't know if there's going to be a lot of lead changes. I think it's going to be a lot of like ties. You know what I mean? Like it could be one of those where, Penn State scores first, SMU answers, and then it's tied for a little bit. And then Penn State scores in the second, and then SMU answers. And so that's how I see this game playing out. It's going to be very, very close.
The ultimate key to this game, guys, to me is can SMU slow down the Penn State run game, and can they protect the quarterback? SMU all season has been a pretty good team at protecting the quarterback. If they can keep Abdul Carter in check, and this becomes a game about athletes, I think they have a shot to pull off this upset. But I don't know that those things are going to get done. That's really what it comes down to. It. I look at the weather forecast. It's going to be 30 degrees, 13 to 15 mile per hour winds. Long way for them to travel. I think this is going to be a hard-fought game. I think SMU is going to keep it close. I have Penn State winning 27-20. This is the one game of all four that we're going to be picking today that I'm least confident in, because I do think SMU has a legitimate shot to win this football game, but I just think Penn State's size, Penn State's power, ultimately, Abdul Carter kind of taking over this game in the fourth quarter. I think those are the things that ultimately are going to determine this game. But if they can protect Kevin Jennings, and he protects the football, I do think SMU can win this game. But at the end of the day, I just think right now that I think Penn State's size, Tyler Warren is a matchup nightmare. And I think Penn State's front four is going to be enough for them to win 27-20. But I do not feel great about that one. Like I'm confident in my pick that I made the right pick, but I think this is the one that I am most confident that if I'm going to get one wrong, this is the one that I would point to as the one I think I'm going to get wrong.
Yeah, this – again, like you guys have nailed, the biggest points. But I think that Penn State controls both lines of scrimmage. I think that they far and away have the better defense, and, whatever weaknesses in the secondary aside, SMU should be able to hit some plays. But I do think that cold weather, noon road game, all that kind of stuff is going to be a factor for SMU. And this is far, again, like we can all criticize Penn State. I think we all think that Notre Dame is a better team than Penn State, and maybe should be hosting SMU in this game, instead of Penn State. At the very least, they should be hosting this game. If not Texas hosting Clemson, But I've got Penn State ultimately winning 31-20. I think somebody else posted that score earlier as well. I think that for a good chunk of the game it'll be close, but I think that Penn State's defense and the weather combined are going to inhibit SMU enough as this game wears on. All right, Texas and Clemson. I just referenced that one. The Longhorns are the number 5 seed in this bracket. Clemson, of course, is the number 12 seed, and they just beat SMU in the ACC championship game last week. This will be next Saturday on TNT at 4 o'clock at Darrell Royal Stadium, of course, in Austin. Texas, a lofty 11-point favorite in this game against the Tigers. The battle of the Orange. Trevor, why don't you start once again and tell us how Texas got here?
Yeah, I think Texas has been one of the more controversial teams of the season. There's a lot of people that talk about, Ohio State lost to Michigan that final week. Notre Dame lost to Northern Illinois. IU hasn't beat anybody. I mean, Texas is right smack dab in the middle of that conversation, man. I really believe so. So Texas started out their season 6-0, and it included in week 2 a really dominant victory over Michigan in the Big House, 31-12. And I think that could have been a lot worse. I think Sark called off the dogs in that one. I do. Mm-hmm. And then the week before the Georgia game, they dominated Oklahoma in the Red River. Now, Oklahoma for the rest of the season really didn't impress that many people, but after Texas beat them 34-3, that victory might have looked a little bit different in some people's eyes after what Oklahoma did to Alabama. Not saying that it moved up people's ranks and, hey, Texas decimated Oklahoma, but I think it adds a little bit more context to that win after what Oklahoma did to the Crimson Tide in Norman. And then the week later, they lost to Georgia at home 30-15. And Brian, we talked about it at the time when we were prepping that game. It kind of just came down to who was the more battle-tested team. Georgia at that point had already played Alabama. They'd already played Clemson. And like we're kind of referencing, Texas really hasn't played anybody. Yeah, they beat Oklahoma, but it wasn't anything special. They beat Michigan, and they were not the team, obviously, that they were last year. And then after that home loss to Georgia, they did go 5-0 to finish the season, but it was up and down, man. It really was. They had an ugly win over Vanderbilt the following week, 27-24. They did blow out Florida and beat them more convincingly than other top teams in the SEC, which I think there's something to be said for that. Mm-hmm. And then they followed that up with an ugly win over Arkansas. And then they handled Kentucky 31-14. And then they finished the regular season beating Texas A&M 17-7. But it was a weird game.
It was sloppy.
Yeah.
They don't turn it over twice in the red zone. It could have been a blowout, but they did turn it over twice in the red zone. You know what I mean? It was a weird game, Trev. I agree with you.
It was, and I think a lot of it has just been the inconsistency and the up and down play of Quinn Ewers. And that right there has kind of led to, yes, on one hand, you have to look at it and say, Quinn Ewers went 5-0 to finish the season after getting blown out by Georgia. But Texas has some issues. They got to figure out a quarterback. Quinn Ewers has to stay healthy. Sark, I believe, needs to commit a little bit more to the run. I saw a stat in the SEC championship game that it was their running back that wasn't Jadon Blue. And the kids, Quintravion, I think that's his name, the running back for Texas. Yeah. He had touched the ball in their final 2 games against Kentucky and then Texas A&M. He touched the ball like a combined 59 times, and the rushing game came alive a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I look at that, and I think that's a direct reflection of why you beat Kentucky by 17, and you were able to go into Kyle Field and win by 10 points. Right. And then you go and you lose to Georgia once again in the SEC championship game, 22-19. And for some, if you just look at that score in a vacuum, they'll say, it was the SEC championship game. Georgia was the runaway favorite in the SEC. Well, the caveat to that is Carson Beck didn't play a snap. Well, technically, that's a lie. Carson Beck played a snap in the second half of that game, and he could not lift his right arm to even take a snap under center. I don't know if you guys saw it, but when he's a right-handed quarterback, and when he went under center, his left hand was on top.
Because I still don't know how,
yeah.
Does Georgia not have a third string quarterback? They just get a run on the play to hand it off for one game?
They have Bobo's kid. They have Jaden Rashada. It was weird.
And what's even funnier about that, if you go back and look at that play, they were on the 2-yard line, and Texas's linebackers were standing in the middle of the end zone, as if they really thought Carson Beck was going to come in and pass. But it is what it is. But that's how Texas ended their season. They finished the year 11-2 without any ranked wins, which is really weird. And then you go back through and you look and say, well, they're the number 5 seed. this matchup is going to be interesting for a lot of reasons. I know Brian's about to dive into what Clemson did and how they got here, but this is another intriguing matchup of teams who are, on one hand, you have a team in Clemson that some people believe shouldn't be here and backdoored their way in. Then you have another team in Texas where people think that they're way too highly ranked. So this is going to be a fun one.
Brian?
I got to be honest. I don't like that we keep saying that Clemson backdoored their way in. When I view backdooring your way in, I think of what Ohio State did in 2022, where literally Clemson lost late in the year to South Carolina, USC lost in the Pac-12 title game, and that's how Ohio State backdoored in without really having to beat anyone because they had lost to Michigan, right? Like they backdoored their way into the playoff. Clemson earned their way in because they won their league championship, right? They had to win it on the field, right? I understand what you're saying, Trey, but like they had to win on the field. Having said that, they aren't sniffing the playoffs if there's not an automatic bid being given. So I understand where you're coming from, but I just think I don't know that that's the adjective that I would use. They benefited from a 12-team playoff having automatic bids to league champions, and they also benefited from having one of the softest ACC schedules that there was. Now, that's kind of what we talk about. When you talk about how Clemson got here, opening win against Georgia.
They backdoored their way into the ACC championship.
There you go. Yes, that you could argue.
Yeah.
But the thing is, they like we said earlier, guys, you can't control the schedule you have. You can only control what you do to it. And when you look at Georgia, the Georgia game was 6-0 at halftime. They had guys getting open, but Cade Klubnik just played terrible football. Georgia ran that one the next week. And they rebounded. They blew out App State the next week, blew out NC State in a game that was 59-35 and not that close. I think it was like 42-7 at one point in time. Blew out Stanford. Beat Florida State convincingly, although it was a sloppy, convincing win. Blew out Wake Forest. Blew out Virginia, another game, 48-31 that wasn't that close. Virginia scored twice late. Blew out, beat a scrappy Virginia Tech team on the road by 10. Blew out Citadel. And then there's 3 other games that you look at and say, okay, none of those teams, what do all those teams have in common? They have a 500 or worse record. Here's who Georgia played this season that had a record of over 500 on the season. They lost 34-3 to Georgia. They got blown out at home by Louisville, 33-21. Game was not that close. Clemson scored late to make it even that. They beat Pitt 24-20 in a game that they had to walk off or not a walk off. They had Cade Klubnik had a long rushing touchdown with about less than a minute to go, I believe, right, Trevor? Is when he had that long touchdown run. And then they got beat by South Carolina in a game that was a hard-fought game, but they blew it at the end. They couldn't stop them at the end. And a big reason why Clemson has not been the team I think that they should be, a lot of people want to point to Cade Klubnik, and I actually don't think Cade Klubnik's the problem. I think Cade Klubnik's been a pretty good football player this year. That kid has 3,300 passing yards. He's thrown 33 touchdowns. He's only thrown 5 interceptions. He's rushed for 458 yards and 7 touchdowns. That kid has accounted for 40 touchdowns. The concern for me is they have not been a team in the trenches that they should be.
Right.
Their offensive line is not as good as it should be. And their defensive line, with all those highly ranked players and how well they played late last season, has not been what it needs to be. If you talk about some things that Coach Sweeney needs to fix in the offseason, he's got to fix his defense. And when you look late in the year, they gave up 350 passing yards to Pitt. They gave up 304 passing yards to SMU. If that game goes to overtime, they're done. They were not going to beat SMU in overtime, in my opinion. They're fortunate they caught that big special teams break at the end of the game. They got, Virginia threw on them pretty effectively. They've had a lot of teams, Georgia in the second half ripped them apart. You look at their total defense this season, guys, and it just down the stretch, they gave up over 5 yards a play in each of their last 4 games. And in 6 of their last 7 games, the only team they held under 5 was Virginia Tech. They've given up over 6 yards a game 4 times this season. Actually, 1, 2, 3, 4 times this season. They're just not the same team defensively. And I say all the time, football is a game of matchups. Clemson's not a great pass rushing team, and they don't have a great secondary. That is the worst thing that you can have about your football team when you're about to play Texas. Because what Texas has done is to teams that can't rush the quarterback and can't cover the pass, they slaughter. If you're going to beat Texas, it's because you are big, physical, and you kick their butts in the trenches. Because, Trev, you nailed it. And we can kind of transition into the matchup part of it, of the discussion, guys, is Georgia is a bad matchup for Texas. Right. They are, because they're big and they're physical. And Coach Sarkisian, for all his brilliance, coached scared in that game. And when you look at, like you had mentioned with Contravion Wisner, Trevor, is like you look at late in the season, their offense was at its best when they were balanced and they were letting him get the football and he was carrying the football. I mean, the last 2 games of the regular season, he goes for $156 on 26 carries against Kentucky, and he goes for $186 on 33 carries against Texas A&M. He carried the ball 19 times against Georgia, but a lot of it was this way. And Georgia was just blowing him off the line. Now, look, not having Kelvin Banks, a first-team All-American left tackle, is a huge part of that. He got knocked out. He got hurt against A&M and didn't play against Georgia. That's a big part of it. He should be back for this game. But I just think this is a bad matchup for Texas or for Clemson. And the other part of it is Clemson's a team that throws the like, really? After all you just said, this is a bad matchup.
I know. It's like, hold it.
What's in your mug there, Drisk? Are you a little something in there? It's a bad matchup for Clemson because on the other side of the ball, Clemson wants to throw the ball around, and they have not been able to get Phil Maffa going against some of the better teams in their schedule. And that's a big part of it. And Texas has one of the best pass defenses in college football. Statistically, and then Jahdae Barron, was first-team All-American, their stud corner. Andrew Makuba, who I thought was going to be out for the first half of this game when they threw that late targeting flag at the end of that game, but they ended up overturning that, so they'll have him for the game. I think this is just a really bad matchup for Clemson. And guys, football is so much about matchups. It's, well, how did this team beat that team and that team beat that team, but then that team beat that team? It doesn't make any sense because it's not about that. It's about matchups. And Clemson is not good in the areas where you need to be good to give Texas problems. And so I think Texas is really just dominates all the matchups. What Clemson tries to do best is what Texas does best. But the difference between this and then the Indiana Notre Dame game is Clemson's not really all that good at that overall. I think Clemson's offense next year is going to be nasty because they've got a lot of very young receivers that now have a year of experience under their belt. And I think if they're able to be patient and continue to grow the offense, I mean, Antonio Williams is only a sophomore. Bryant Wesco's a freshman. TJ Moore's a freshman. Cole Turner's a redshirt sophomore. Like, they're a very young team in the pass game. They can figure out the offensive line. Their offense could be really good next year. They've got to find answers on defense because I just don't think they're very good defensively. And the teams that they had that won titles had elite defenses, and this team is not that. And I think Texas is going to eat them up because I just don't see how they can slow them down. The only thing that could happen, guys, and this goes back to your point, Trev, is does Quinn Ewers play well or not?
Right.
Because if Quinn Ewers, I mean, he can have guys open. He's going to throw the ball into the ground or sail things, do things like that. I mean, if he is on, then Clemson has no chance. The only way Clemson has a chance in this game, in my opinion, is if Quinn Ewers just throws him the ball. I mean, I just think matchup-wise, I just don't – there's nothing about this matchup that I like for Clemson against Texas.
Not either. Go ahead, Trevor.
Well, and Steve Sarkisian, for his genius mind, if he's as smart as what people attribute him to be, I hope he learned his lesson against Georgia and takes the lessons that he learned from the Kentucky game and the Texas A&M game and use his running backs more. Clemson ranks 92nd in the country in yards per rush allowed. They rank 73rd in the country in rushing yards per game allowed. So if you're smart and you have a quarterback that's kind of struggling right now, like, let's call it what it is. I mean, when you are a bad throw away from potentially putting in Arch Manning every single time you make a bad pass, I mean, rely on your run game. Put Texas's offense in a position where they don't need Quinn Ewers to go 25 of 33 for 300 yards and 4 touchdowns to beat a Clemson team, right? So, but I'm with you. Matchups overall across the board. Texas's defense, I mean, it's a different animal than SMU's defense. And that's not a knock on SMU. It's a different level of play. And Clemson in the second half of that game, when they had to drive down the field and when they had to put together a methodical drive, couldn't do it against SMU's defense. I don't really see that narrative changing against Texas at Texas.
When Clemson was elite, they had an elite, when they were winning national championships, they had 2 elite quarterbacks, they had elite defensive lines, they had NFL wide receivers, and, they had pretty good offensive lines as well. They have none of those things right now. The quarterback is not horrible. He's been better, I think, than most people thought that he was going to be. But but the matchup specifically against this team, Texas, I just think the Texas defense is too good. And the like up front specifically, I feel like their physicality and their athleticism is going to show through. I think it's going to be a long day for Klubnik. And I just, like you said, I don't like this matchup for Clemson at all in this.
Mhm.
Like when you look at Texas, they've given up over 20 points or more only twice this season. Once was to Georgia in the first meeting, and the other one was to Vanderbilt, which was at least a ranked team. And again, like a Vanderbilt team that over exceeded a lot of people's expectations this season. Otherwise, they have given up next to nothing against almost everybody this year. And like Clemson is where they are, again, because they were able to sneak into that ACC championship game and won a favorable matchup with SMU, barely by the time it was all said and done. But I just don't like this matchup for the Tigers at all.
I agree, Sean. And the thing about Cade Klubnik is he's a good college. He's turning into a good college quarterback. He's a true junior, but he's not the type of put the team on your shoulders, put the program on your shoulders like Deshaun Watson was, like Trevor Lawrence was, and even like Taj Boyd was before Deshaun Watson. He's just not that kind of kid, and maybe he never will be, but he's definitely not that way yet. He's a kid that can really run that offense, and he can make plays with his legs. Again, he's got over 3,700 yards of total offense this year. He's got 40 touchdowns this year. He's only thrown 5 picks against a schedule that wasn't overly challenging, if we're being honest. And a lot of times when he struggled because he's getting harassed by the defense. And when you look at the Clemson run defense, Trevor, they have not been good this year. I would say the only caveat I have is most of the teams that have run on them are teams that have mobile quarterbacks or run the option, like the Citadel went for 288. They're an option team. South Carolina ran all over them. But then we watched them just get bulldozed by the offensive line of Louisville. And Louisville doesn't have a mobile quarterback. They ran with their running backs. And so and a lot of it was their defensive line just got pushed around. And they've got a lot of highly ranked guys, a lot of former top 100 recruits, some 5-star guys there. And, Sean, that to me is the 3 things that are the biggest difference between Clemson now and Clemson then. It's not even quarterback. It's definitely not nearly as good, but it's there. And they were never great along the offensive line back then.
Right. That's why I said they had good offensive lines, not great offensive lines.
But they had dynamic skill on the perimeter.
Yes.
Whether it was Mike Williams, and Deion Kane and Artavius Scott and Hunter Renfrow and I think Jordan Leggett in 2016, and then you had T. Higgins and Justin Ross and Hunter Renfrow in 2018. And then at cornerback, you had 2 highly drafted players in Trayvon Mullen and AJ Terrell at cornerback in 2018. So they had legit big time skill on the perimeters, and they had elite defensive lines. Yep. And the biggest thing that's hurt them is they're not getting that same level of skill on the perimeter, and they're not getting the same defensive line. And the fact that they don't have the type of quarterback that can put the team on their shoulders is, Phil Moffa is a nice running back. He's not Travis Etienne. He's not even Wayne Gallman, in my opinion. And that's really killing them right now. It's not Cade Klubnik. It's the defensive line is not that good. It's their secondary is very vulnerable. Their best DB last year is in the NFL in Nate Wiggins, and their second best DB last year is now starting at safety for Texas. And Andrew Makuba, right? And so that's been the biggest disappointment for me this season. I really thought that defensive line with these rising sophomores and juniors that are really highly ranked, talented kids, we're going to take a jump, and they don't. And that's the area that Coach Sweeney is going to have to look at this offseason is, do we really have the right people running our defense?
Yeah.
And that's going to be a big thing to change. And that's why I think this Texas matchup is so bad for them.
Because it's been, 4-5 years now since that line where all 4 guys got drafted with Dexter
18,
Lawrence.
right?
Yeah.
Gosh,
6 years? Man, has it been that long? But I mean, really, that was probably what you'd call a generational defensive line when you got that much talent up front. But they've had nowhere close to that since then.
And heck, Sean, remember Dexter Lawrence got suspended for the postseason that year.
Right.
And Niles Pinckney steps in, and he's a really good football player. You know what I mean? But when you can lose a guy like Dexter Lawrence and still have, the other end that they had was a Clellan Ferrell was a top 5 draft pick. You know what I mean? Like they had Xavier Thomas at the time, remember, as a true freshman before he had all those injuries, was a dominant freshman. And I'm certainly drawing a blank. I'm big time drawing a blank on Christian Wilkins. Christian Wilkins is who I was drawing a blank on. Xavier Thomas is a true freshman that year at 10.5 tackles for loss. They had Isaiah Simmons on the second level. They were loaded, dude, up front, and they were really good, and they were very disruptive, and they're just not that. They haven't been that since Brent Venables left. And that's the thing that everybody talks about, the offense and this and that. And the offense is good enough to win a lot of games. The defense is the problem. That's what that crushes them, is that, Matt Luke's got to find some answers up front. I think that's going to help him, going into his second year next year with the offensive line. And he's going to have a lot of guys back, but they've got to find answers on defense. But in this matchup, like, Texas is the worst matchup, in my opinion. Texas and Notre Dame would have been the two worst matchups for Clemson in the first round, in my opinion. And I don't know that this game is going to be overly close, to be honest with you.
All right, so let's go ahead and make our picks then before we move on to our last game of the first round.
Yeah, I have Texas winning this one. I have Texas winning 31-17. And it's going to be one of those games where, yes, I know it's a 14-point game. I think it'll be one of those similar narrative to the Michigan game where, like, it's just it won't be that close when you watch it. I think when you look across the board, I think Clemson's just outmanned in a lot of ways. And if Texas is able to find a running game like they had their last two games of the regular season, it's a big if, because I am putting my faith into Steve Sarkisian committing to the run game, not, all right, playoffs, time to show you guys how smart I am. If he's able to call a good game and Wisner is able to go off, they get Jadon Blue involved in the back or in the passing game out of the backfield, and just ask Quinn Ewers to go be a game manager where he's at his best. That is when he's at his best, because we talk about Cade Klubnik not being the guy to put the team on his shoulders. He's Quinn Ewers. Right. At least he hasn't showed it to me yet. So if they can just get him comfortable and say, hey, listen, we don't need you to go be Superman. We need you to go play point guard, is when he's at his best. That's what he did against Michigan. Then I think it's going to be a really, really long day for Clemson. So 31-17, Texas is my prediction.
You keep talking about Quinn Ewers, and I think you're absolutely spot on there. When he is on, he's really good. When he's not on, he's very average. And the reality is he's been very average their last four games. I mean, he rips up Florida, looks great against Florida, who I think was missing DJ Lagway. I think they were missing their best corner, didn't play in that game either, right? So they were missing some guys, rips them up, had some big-time throws against Vanderbilt. But then since he injured his ankle, he's averaged 5.5, 6.2, 7.8, 7.8 yards per attempt. He threw for a lot of yards against Texas. I mean, it's Georgia. And he made some big-time throws in that game, but he also had some big-time misses. But in the second half, when they needed him to make some of those clutch throws, he just missed them. He had a guy in the end zone. If he just makes a good throw on a back shoulder throw in the end zone, they win that game. They don't kick a field goal to tie it at the end. They win that game. And that's the mark of a great quarterback, is that drive right there where they tied the game instead of winning the game. That's the difference between the guys that are champions and the guys that are not. It's those kind of drives, guys, right there. Deshaun Watson, Trevor Lawrence, Vince Young, Colt McCoy, those guys, Texas scores on that drive and they win the football game. Flat out. That's how that game goes. And that's why I think this game won't be as bad as it could otherwise be. And that's why I have this game being 31-17. I have Texas winning this game 31-17. I don't think it's going to be all that close. The Texas offense should dominate. I think getting Kelvin Banks back is going to help Quinn Ewers being a little bit more confident in the pocket. But I don't think Clemson has enough in this game. And I look at Steve Sarkisian against, what's their D coordinator's name? Wes Goodwin, right? Like that's the biggest mismatch in this game. And that ultimately is going to be what determines the outcome, is that matchup right there. I originally had 35-17, but I start talking about Quinn Ewers and just what not to expect from him. And I talked myself down a few points. I originally had 35-17, but I'm going to settle in on 31-17.
Yeah, we're all in the same ballpark relatively. I've got Texas winning 35-17. I just flat out think, again, like, is Clemson's offensive line horrible? No, it's not horrible. It's a solid enough offensive line, but Texas just gets to the quarterback. And I think that that's a bad recipe for Klubnik. Like, they have given up 17 sacks in their last 5 games, Clemson has. And Texas is 9th in the nation in sacks. So I just think athletically and physically, it's just far too much of a mismatch for the Tigers. So I've got it 35-17 Longhorns. All right, last game of the first round. It's funny because before the final bracket came out, we were sitting there on my show and we were going through, some of the scenarios, like what if this team wins the Big 12? What if this team wins, all this different stuff. No matter what happened, the 8-9 matchup stayed the same. It was destined to be Ohio State hosting Tennessee, and that's what we ended up with. And it'll be the primetime game Saturday night at Ohio Stadium. The Buckeyes are a 7-point favorite. So, Brian, we'll start with you on this one with how the Buckeyes got to this position.
It's interesting, guys. I think of all the issues of the first round matchups, I think the team that got screwed the most by the seeding is Tennessee, because they should not have had to play Ohio State in the first round. Guys, this is an Ohio State team that when they have been on their game this year has been a really impressive team. Started the season off with a 52-6 win over Akron, then beat Western Michigan 56-0. That's a Western Michigan team that at times has been able to score a little bit this year, completely shut them down. Beat Marshall 49-14 in a game that was competitive early. Marshall played with them a little bit early, and then Ohio State really pulled it out in the second half. That's a Marshall team that went 10-3, and Ohio State beat them by 35. They went on the road, and again, the next two games were very similar. Didn't start off great against Michigan State. Didn't start off great against Iowa. I think it was 7-0 at halftime against Iowa, and then poured it on in the second half and really put those teams away. And then they go out and play Oregon, and it was one of those weird games where if you talk to an Ohio State fan, they're going to talk about how they were this close to doing this, but if you talk to an Oregon fan, they're going to be like, hey, your first score shouldn't have counted because the guy literally never caught it. The receiver, tight end, never had possession of the throw. They'll have all these excuses, but at the end of the day, the reality is Ohio State lost a hard-fought game, and then they were just not right, really, the next couple games offensively. I think they struggled big time against Nebraska. Their offense really struggled against Penn State. I thought when they put the game away late with that late drive that was going to be the thing that Ohio State finally found their answer. And they, just Penn State can't score late. Ohio State just got to stop them from getting 2 first downs, and you get the ball, and Ohio State just ran it right down their throat. I thought, okay, now Ohio State's going to get back to playing Ohio State football, right? Beat Purdue 45-0, had an ugly 31-7 win over Northwestern, and then smacked Indiana. But you kind of started to see some issues in that game, fellas, because the defense is really what carried that team all season. I mean, the most points they gave up in a game was 32 to Oregon. After that, the next most points they gave up was 17 to Nebraska. I mean, they were a dominant defense. They shut down Indiana's offense. Indiana fans can talk all they want about special teams is why we lost that game. No, you lost that game because you had 151 yards of offense and averaged 2.56 yards per play. I don't care if you don't have both of those special teams mistakes. Okay, you only lose 24-15 or 27-15. You're still losing.
You still weren't scoring.
Exactly. And the only reason they got their last score is because that's when Ohio State kind of was like, okay, we've got a big lead. Right. And they went and punched one in late. That game was, it was a 23-point win for Ohio State, guys. And it really wasn't that close of a game. It really wasn't that close of a game. And it could have been a whole lot worse. 31-7 when Ohio State scored, or Indiana scored with 1:53 left to make it 31-15. And then Ohio State went right down the field and scored a touchdown in a minute. So that was really the thing, is Ohio State's offense, even in that game, they didn't score 38 points because of their offense. They scored 38 points because of their defense and special teams. So looking at it from the Ohio State standpoint, I do think there was something to that. Then, of course, they go out in that game against Michigan and just did what they always do. They just don't show up against that football team. And I don't understand it. I don't know why Michigan has their number, because Michigan is just not a good football team. They're really not. They're not a good football team, and they especially weren't a very good football team coming down the
solid defensive team, but that offense
right.
is just
it's not good. It's not good. And you can't score more than 10 points against them. That's really the issue going into the season, this postseason for Ohio State, is what version of their offense is going to show up. Now, if you look at this Buckeye team, I think they were pretty banged up late in the year. Seth McLaughlin was out. Their left tackle's been out for a while. They're another team that I think in some ways not playing in the Big Ten title game could end up being the best thing to happen to this Ohio State football team, because they get that extra little bit of rest. That's one less game of beating. Now, they would have had the same amount of time off if they would have beat Oregon, but if they'd have lost to Oregon, you not only have to play that extra game, you got to then play again in 2 weeks. They needed to get healthy. They needed to regroup. it's all going to come down to, as we dive into this, and Trevor's going to talk a little bit about how Tennessee got here. But when we dive into the matchup part, guys, it's going to be about what version of Ohio State are we going to get. Tennessee has kind of been who they've been most of the year. Ohio State, you really don't know what version you're going to get from week to week.
Yeah, and I don't know how much that break is going to help out Ohio State. I don't know about their left tackle, but Seth McLaughlin's out for the year. He tore his Achilles. So it's going to be interesting to see how they
talk about Notre Dame. They've got now extra time to figure out how to get that unit together is what I'm referring to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Tennessee, it's been a weird season for them, if I'm just being 100% honest. Like it was a lot of this, a lot of ups and downs. They started out the season on an offensive explosion. In their first 3 games, they scored 69. Now, mind you, these opponents are not good, but scoring they're not. But you go through and you look at what they did: 69 points against Chattanooga, 51 against NC State, 71 points against Kent State. Now, those are not good football teams, but putting up over 50 points in 3 straight games is noteworthy, right? But then once they got into SEC play, not only did that dip below 50, they didn't score over 30 points again until Mississippi State, when they scored 33. Now, along that road, they were upset. They lost to Arkansas on October 5th, 19-14. That was an ugly game. It was at Arkansas, which is, I guess, why people are labeling Arkansas a tough place to play now, I suppose, because Tennessee lost there. I'm not buying into it. But then 2 weeks later, after they lost to Arkansas, they beat Alabama at home 24-17 in a game where we were kind of talking about whoever wins, whoever loses, potentially might start losing the locker room a little bit. Like it's one of those games where it's like, okay, like what happens to Alabama if they lose that game? Well, we kind of went on to see what happened, because I think that was a week after. Was that a week after Alabama lost to Vanderbilt?
2
weeks. 2 weeks. Because Alabama didn't drop back to back. You're right. So, so you go and you start looking at what happened with those games. And then Tennessee had another big matchup against Georgia in the middle of November. They lost that one 31-17. Now, they did enough in the regular season, and they had enough losses above them to put them in a position where, yes, they didn't play in the SEC championship game, but they solidified themselves enough in the rankings that going into championship week, they were a lock essentially to get into the first round of the college football playoffs. A lot of people talk about Nico and how good he was. Towards the end of the season, he had 15 touchdown passes, and I think 14 of them came against the Chattanoogas of the world, NC State, Kent State, Mississippi State. So, against big top-level teams, he didn't really perform that well. He just played well enough to not lose the game, but he's not going out and actively winning football games for Tennessee, right? So something that's going to be factored into their matchup against Ohio State. He relied on, a really, really good defense and a really good run game with Dylan Sampson to get them to this point. So all encompassing, that's where Tennessee's at.
Can I say something about Tennessee real quick, Trev? The way they started the season and the way they ended the season is makes you say, who are they? Because if you look at how they started the season, their offense first 3 weeks, people are talking about Nico being a Heisman candidate, which is, again, why it's so stupid to make those type of, conversations in September. I know we have, articles to sell and, shows that we need to get people to click on and watch and all that. I understand that, but it's freaking September against not very good teams. But I felt like they were a very mediocre offense for a long time. But about the second quarter of that UTEP game, they started to dominate. I was like, well, it's freaking UTEP. They're terrible. And then they came out early against Vanderbilt and looked exactly like the same team they had been kind of all year. And then all of a sudden the light went on and they rolled Vanderbilt in a way that nobody else had rolled Vanderbilt for the next 2.5 quarters. And that's the thing is, if they can find a way to tap into that more often, then that makes them a little bit dangerous. But that's what happens when you're young at quarterback. You're going to have some of that, right? You're going to have some of that. And I'll tell you what, I give Josh Heupel a lot of credit. This is the second time in his career I think he has a team ahead of schedule as far as how good they are. He had them ahead of schedule 2 years ago. They were better than they should have been 2 years ago, and I think he has them ahead of schedule this year. I think he's done a really quietly, really good job at Tennessee. He really has. And they battled some injuries too this year. James Pierce hasn't been healthy a chunk of the season. He's played, but hasn't been 100%. I think Tennessee earned their playoff berth. I do. I think Tennessee should have been playing on the road. But I think that you could have maybe had some conversations after the Georgia loss about where they belong. but I think they showed me something, the way that they bounced back, especially the way they beat Vanderbilt, who's not a great football team by any stretch, but Vanderbilt was at least competitive against a lot of people, and they smoked them. I mean, it was 17. They were down 17-0 in that game and just still rolled. So Tennessee showed me a little bit something, and these are two teams that ended the season on very different notes. Very different notes. And I don't know that Vanderbilt and Michigan are super different as football teams. And
I agree, because they're both really good defensive teams. And I think if you just think of Tennessee, probably because of Heupel, you think more offense. And, like you said, they started off with this supersonic offense, but then they got, into the heart of SEC play, and that offense kind of disappeared before it reemerged, like you talked about at the end of the season. And that's why, like when I look at this matchup, to me, it is just a very even matchup. It deserves to be the 8-9 game. Like you said, Tennessee looked like they were probably going to be out of the playoff after they got bounced by Georgia, but then that's about the time all these other upsets started happening, and it opened the door for them.
Yeah,
again.
we choked. So Alabama was like, "Hold my beer." Yeah, we're gonna show how
exactly
how to
right.
choke. You know
exactly
what I mean?
Right.
Like,
that's exactly. So, are there any specific matchups that you guys are looking at when you look at this game?
Well, for me, there's a couple, right? And there's two matchups of the Ohio State offense against the Tennessee defense that I think are polar opposites that are who performs well in this game. And here's where it is. If this was an inside run period, right? We're football coaches, right? So if this is an inside run period, Tennessee's going to dominate. Inside run, for those of you who maybe didn't play football, it's a period where literally it's just your linemen and your tight end and your running backs and the front seven, and you're just working on run game, right? If this was an inside run period, Tennessee will dominate Ohio State. Simmons has been down all year. McLaughlin, who just won the Remington Trophy, he's out. Donovan Jackson's still there. Carson Hinsman's in starting center now. It's an okay line at this point in time, and Tennessee's defensive line is really, really good most of the time. And now that James Pierce has 3 weeks to recover and get healthy, is he going to look like the top 5 overall draft pick version of him, which he's looked like that at times, but he's clearly been slowed down at times this season. Still productive. You know what I mean? For when you look at his numbers, he's still very productive for a guy who hasn't been healthy for a big chunk of the year. If this was a 7-on-7 game, Ohio State's offense dominates because there's a big mismatch at receiver, in my opinion. Tennessee secondary is okay, but as I've been saying all year, guys, there's a lot of average secondaries in the SEC this year. And Ohio State has the skill talent to take advantage of that. And that's where it comes down to, here's the great unknown. And here's where I thought Ohio State being a preseason number 1 or 2 team at the beginning of the year was going to be their detriment is Will Howard. That's what it boils down to for me. Ohio State's offense. Tennessee has shown they can win by just asking their young quarterback to be a game manager. When Will Howard can't be a game manager because this offense requires the quarterback to be dominant. And when he's not, and I don't think he's as good of a quarterback, I think when I look at Will Howard, I see a lot of hollow numbers. And I had a debate with a good buddy of mine the other day, and he was talking about LSU and how good Garrett Nussmeier was. And he was talking about his yards. And I said, those are a lot of hollow numbers because when you throw the ball 50 times, you better have over 300 yards. And when I look at Will Howard, I see a guy that's put up numbers, 27 touchdowns, 9.1 yards per attempt, 2,800 yards passing and all that type of stuff. But I see a guy that put up a lot of hollow numbers. And when he's played good defenses, he's struggled. Against Penn State and Michigan in those 2 games, and you could even include Indiana in that game. In those games, he has had 5 touchdowns and 4 picks against those 3 teams.
Right.
Best teams he's played all year. And he's a guy that I don't really trust him in this moment. So if you're a typical Ohio State team, you're going to need your run game to carry the day against this kind of team. But I don't think they can do that, guys. They haven't shown the willingness to be a team that builds around their running backs the way they need to. And B, I don't think they can if they wanted to because of the injuries they have up front. I don't know that Ohio State is capable of really going out and just running the ball on a good team. They went for $115 and sub-4 per carry against Indiana. They went for 77 yards and sub-3 yards a carry against Michigan. Are they capable of running the ball?
They should have just
been
throwing the ball against Michigan.
I mean, I still don't understand that. It's like they were trying. It's like I think Ryan, Trev, was it you that said it or Vince that said it? It was all about Ryan Day's ego. He wanted to prove that they could just run on Michigan, and they couldn't. Yeah. If they would have thrown on Michigan the way that Indiana did early in that game, they would have won that game. Even if it was ugly, they'd have won that game. But I don't know. Can you protect Will Howard against that front seven? If you can protect Will Howard against that front seven, then Ohio State has a shot to move the football and to score enough points to win. The reason that so that's the matchup when you look at the Ohio State offense against Tennessee defense. That's really the key. Can you protect Will Howard? Because if you can, he doesn't have to be great because they have an advantage on the perimeter. And it's up to Chip Kelly and Ryan Day to design a way to get their stud receivers the football more and in space. The 3 weeks off, to me, if I'm Tennessee, I'm a little bit nervous about that because it's going to allow them to kind of scheme up some ways to get those guys the football. But at the end of the day, if they can't protect Will Howard against that vaunted pass rush, it may not matter. And that on that side of the ball, that's the intriguing matchup of that from the Ohio State offense with the Tennessee defense.
Yeah, to me, this game comes down to a couple things. One, I'm still going to touch on it. It's Ryan Day's ego, and he has done things this season that puts me in a spot where I can't trust him. You know, like you go through and you look, and I mean, if you thought the noise was loud going into Michigan and they can't run on Michigan and they're not as physical as Michigan, it has a better defense and a better front seven and better rushing numbers against teams than Michigan, Tennessee. Mm-hmm. So if Ryan Day goes into this game and he's just like, see, we are physical, we are aggressive, you're going to lose, dude. You're going to lose big. Trust in the guys that you have on the perimeter to go out and make plays. Now, for Ohio State on offense, I agree with everything that you guys said about Will Howard. The detriment's going to be, to me, because of the byproduct of Will Howard not playing well in big moments is because his running backs haven't played well in big moments. Mm-hmm. You went out and threw a bag at this SEC running back, and you did that to average 2.9 yards a carry against Purdue, 3.8 against Michigan, 2.1 against Oregon, and 2.9 against Nebraska, right? For all these people talking about, man, Quinshon Judkins this and Judkins that, like that's going to be a big deciding factor in this game because that's going to put Will Howard in a spot where he has to put the team on his back. And I'm with you guys. I don't think that he has it. To me, in big games, he's 0 for 3. I don't care what his final stat line said against Oregon, right? He, in the Oregon game, boneheaded slide. I'm sorry. Like you have to have more awareness than that. That's a true freshman, true sophomore type of mistake. And you're a transfer. You have senior year eligibility. You've played in big moments before. That's ultimately, it's not the only thing that cost them the game against Oregon, but that was the nail in the coffin. You go and you look, Penn State's only touchdown of the day, pick 6. Now, the rest of your team carried you enough to go on and win. And that was still
fumbled a ball into the end zone that kept them from blowing that game out because they were on the verge of blowing Penn State out if he doesn't fumble that ball in the end zone.
Right. And then you go and you look at what he did against Michigan, 57% completion percentage, 1 touchdown pass, 2 interceptions against Michigan. And their best player in the secondary, arguably best player on the team, Will Johnson, didn't even play. Mm-hmm. So you have this streak of big games where Will Howard has played in, and he's been meh. In the moments where they needed him, in the moments where they needed him to go and be the quarterback like they thought he was going to be, he hasn't. Now, I think that's a big issue. So to me, this game comes down to, is Will Howard going to finally make a moment in a big game? Can Quinshon Judkins finally, can Quinshon Judkins finally be the running back that they paid him to be?
Play against a team with a pulse.
Right. And can Ryan Day finally be the coach that people think that he's going to be or want him to be, whatever? That's a lot of things going against Ohio State, opposed to you look at Tennessee, it's like, can Nico just be a game manager? And it's like, that's my thing.
Sean, you got something you want to add to that? Because I have some thoughts on the other side of the ball as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say I don't know who I have less confidence in, Will Howard or Ryan Day in this situation.
Which is that's a scary thing for the Buckeyes, though, right, Sean? I mean, your quarterback and your freaking head coach.
Exactly, because Ryan Day, for all the things that we might say about him, the only home losses that he have been to Oregon and to Michigan. He's got a pretty good track record.
Right.
But he's also not played another team like this, like a Tennessee, where other than Penn State, who else has he played in those kind of situations at home? And now there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of, all the lingering stuff that comes out of you just lost your last game, home game to Michigan. That's why you're in this situation to begin with. Maybe there's a chance they'd still be playing a home game, but there's a greater chance that they'd be playing that home game, either against Clemson or, Boise State or SMU or, one of those kind of teams. They're in this situation because they completely choked against Michigan. So I just as even as this matchup is, I have very little confidence in both Ohio State's quarterback and their head coach.
Then you look at Tennessee guys and you look at the other side of the ball, and Tennessee is going to have equally tough time against because why is Ohio State where they are? We just got done saying their head coach is very mid in a lot of ways. Their quarterback can't win big games. Their offensive line's a hot mess. Their stud running back is, and I use air quotes on stud running back. He's one of the biggest front runners in college football, in my opinion. And I'll tell you what, I'm probably still picking Ohio State to win. Why? Because on the other side of the ball, they're as good as there is in the country. In my opinion, they are. They're as good as there is in the country. And I don't know that Tennessee has, there's one bit of kryptonite for Ohio State. If you have burners on the outside, you can hurt them. We saw that with Evan Stewart and Tez Johnson. I don't know that Dante Thornton is enough. Now, Dante Thornton's a big play guy. He's at over 25 yards a catch, but he's a long strider type of player. Is he enough in the pass game to take advantage of Ohio State? Is he enough? Because you're going to have a tough time running the ball on Ohio. Well, in theory, you should have a tough time running the ball on Ohio State. This is a team that's really has a great defense. Their run defense has been pretty solid all season. For the Buckeyes, they have one of the top pass defenses in college football. All those things are great. But here's the thing that we're going to find out in this game, fellas. And here's where I could completely get this prediction wrong. My concern with Ohio State is, and some of you Buckeye fans and Big Ten fans are not going to like this, I don't think the Big Ten's very good this year, guys. I don't. And I think the Big Ten has a lot of bad offenses. And I think that plays a little bit of a role in why Ohio State is as good as they are defensively. And I've said all year, boy, that run defense is really, really good. And then I watched Michigan run on them with no threat of throwing the football. None. And still ran for 172 yards on them. And when Ohio State needed to put that game away late, or not put the game away, but when Ohio State needed to make a stop to get the ball back, their defense couldn't stop Michigan from running the football on them. And so I wonder, how good is Ohio State really? But I can only go with what I know. And what I know right now is Ohio State has been on this stage before. They have a big-time defense. They're going to be at home. And I don't know that I trust that Tennessee has the speed needed to beat them enough in the pass game to win this football game. And so that's the part of the matchup that's going to be key. If Tennessee's going to win this game, I think their defense has to force Ohio State into big mistakes. That's going to be the key. You're going to have to get the ball from Will Howard. You're going to have to force him into some sort of turnover, some sort of big mistake that gives you short fields, because I don't know that Tennessee can consistently move the ball up and down the field against these type of teams. I don't.
See, and that's the thing, Penn State made him make a couple mistakes, but they just didn't have the horses offensively to capitalize when it was all said and done.
Right. And that's the issue with the Big Ten. And Big Ten fans, this is the best conference, and all. I don't agree with that this year. I don't know that there is an elite conference this year. I don't know that any conference is great this year. But one thing that I don't think is debatable is that the Big Ten is just not good offensively this year. The best offense in the Big Ten is what? Ohio is outside of Oregon is what? Ohio State. Yeah. Well, Oregon went for over 300 yards against or 30 points, and I think almost 500 yards against Ohio State. There's only so Indiana has a high scoring offense, but they didn't play anybody. There's two good offenses in the Big Ten outside of Ohio State, and they shut one of them down, and the other one moved on them. So which one is it? Are you the team that shut down Indiana, or are you the team that shut down or that kind of got rolled a little bit by Oregon? That's the kind of what we're going to find out this week. I tend to lean towards them being the team that they look like against Indiana, and not the team that they were against Oregon defensively. I think that was a bit of an anomaly with their secondary. I do. I think that just the way that they got ripped up by Tez Johnson, and I think Evan Stewart, that was a money game for Evan Stewart, if I'm being honest with you. That was the game where he's going to show the NFL what he's all about. And I thought Denzel Burke played a bad game. Guys, it happens. It's like what we talk about with Notre Dame against USC. I think Ohio State just played a bad game defensively. I think they're better than what they showed against Oregon. And I think the Indiana game was the thing that kind of showed me that. But they're going to have to slow down Dylan Sampson to do that. If they can shut down the Tennessee run game and make Nico beat them, to your point, Trev, Nico has not been asked to be a playmaker this year in SEC play. It's manage the game, but to beat a team like Ohio State, to beat a team like Georgia, at some point in time, your quarterback is going to have to make some plays. And against Alabama, their defense played so well, he didn't have to. But against Georgia, he needed to. Against Arkansas, he needed to, and he couldn't do it. And that's why they lost those 2 football games. I think Ohio State is good enough defensively to put them in some situations where we're going to say, Nico's going to have to beat us. And if he can make some big plays throwing the ball and with his legs, then I think that they can win this football game. If he can't, then I think Ohio State wins this football game. That's really what it comes down to, is make Nico beat you. And I don't know if he can. But it could also, is this the coming out party for a kid like Nico? That's what we're going to find out.
All right, let's pick it then. Who's going first? Trevor?
Yeah. So for me, I think there's just too much stacked up against Ohio State. I do. There's questions around quarterback play, questions around the head coach, questions around the offensive line. There's questions around the identity of the team. How good is this team? Look, I don't know if I'm on the train anymore either of like, well, Ohio State doesn't have a big game problem. They have a Michigan problem. It's like, well, then if that's the case, why does Ryan Day not have a national championship yet with all the teams that he's had? You know what I'm saying? Look, I would hear that out if they had a Michigan problem and every year in the first round of the playoffs or every year in the national championship, they played Michigan and just can't beat that team. But like let's call a spade here. You can't be on the side of, well, we think Penn State's overrated and IU's not as good if you're an Ohio State fan, and then turn it around and be like, oh, Ryan Day's not good in big games. Well, he beat Penn State and IU. So, like, where are we at? You know what I mean? So when I look at this game, yes, maybe they had a Michigan problem when they had Harbaugh and they had J.J. McCarthy and Blake Corum and all those guys, a really good defense. Look, I think it's too easy of a cop-out to say, just stop Dylan Sampson and you win. Nobody's stopped Dylan Sampson this year. Arkansas did a good job. They won.
Georgia did in the second half,
Yeah.
which is why it went from 17-17 tie to 31-17 loss.
Right. But Ohio State's defense couldn't stop Khalil Mullings. He was better than Khalil Mullings, Dylan Sampson.
I get that, Trev, but at some point in time, you have to say, over the course of the season, were they very good at stopping the run over the course of the season? Yes or no? Yes, they were. They were, right? So it's like saying, like, well, because Notre Dame's pass defense sucked against USC, that means they sucked, even though the rest of the season showed a different story. I mean, and again, I brought up the end of the Michigan game. That was not a good look for Ohio State's defense. I think part of it is they were worn down because they've been carrying this dang team for so long.
Sure.
And that's where I think the 3 weeks off is going to be important, because not a lot of other teams ran the ball on them like that. Oregon had a couple nice runs, but they only went for $155. They shut down Penn State's run game. They shut down Nebraska's run game. They completely dominated Indiana's run game. They shut down Marshall's run game, who has a good run game, has a team that can run the football this season. If you look at it, but that's the question, though, Trevor, right? Is it an anomaly, right? Was it an anomaly game, or is this who Ohio State actually is when they play a good rushing team? I mean, that's the question that we don't know. But it's like, if you're going to say that their rush defense is not very good because Khalil Mullings ran on them, then we have to say that Notre Dame's pass defense isn't actually good because of how Jaden Maeva ran through on them.
Sure. I mean, but I also don't think that Michigan's the only team that had success on the ground against them. Like, I guess you can say, well, only Oregon went for $155 and 2 touchdowns on the ground, but they went for 155 yards. And
it's not a great performance. I mean, if you average 155 yards a game rushing the football, you would rank where? Let's see. You would, in the national, you'd rank 76th in the nation in rushing if you averaged 155 yards a game, right? I mean, so that's not a great. And also, when you look at Oregon, what is Oregon's season average rushing the football this year? Their season average is 171. They held them 16 yards below their season average. You know what I mean? So, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I just think if you're going to Oregon at home hold them to 155 yards, that's a solid rushing game performance. That's not like getting gashed. You know what I mean? Like that's
Sure.
all I'm saying, right?
And Oregon doesn't have Dylan Sampson.
No, I get that. Jordan James is no bum. Yeah,
I agree, but my point is, Brian,
Right.
I don't like this mentality. We'll just stop Dylan Sampson.
Sure.
Okay.
It's lazy.
Like just stop Jeremiah Smith. Okay. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Well,
like, it's not, you can't look at it both ways like that.
What it is, you have to make Nico beat you. So, I mean, you can think that my take is lazy, but I don't think it. I think that, look, you have to be able to slow down. You can't let Dylan Sampson beat you. You have to make Nico beat you. Right. I mean, that's simple as that. And that's really what it comes down to. Now, the question is, can they? Because, like, we talk about Notre Dame. Yeah, every team that played Notre Dame the last half of the season said stop their run game and make Riley Leonard beat you with the pass game. Well, okay. Nobody could do it.
So that's why for my prediction, I'm saying I don't think that they can.
I understand that. But what I'm saying is, like, I mean, we're having a discussion here about it, right? Is I don't think just saying because they didn't do well in one game that their rush defense sucks. That's what I'm saying. Because I felt like you were pushing back on my comment saying you've got to stop the run game and make Nico beat you.
No, I wasn't pushing back on I was saying for my prediction specifically, I don't think Ohio State's going to be able to stop Dylan Sampson. I think it's a cop-out answer to just say, well, just stop Dylan Sampson and Tennessee can't do it.
Okay, but that's what I'm saying. So you're saying I made a cop-out answer because that's what I said that Ohio State has to do.
No, I'm saying there's people in the chat that have just been saying, you stop Dylan Sampson, Tennessee doesn't do anything. I think it's a taller order to ask of a team to just say, oh, we'll just stop their best player.
Sure.
I mean, yeah, duh. Well, how do you beat Oregon? Well, you just stop Tez Johnson and Dylan Gabriel. Good luck. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, to your point that you brought up, well, to beat Notre Dame, you just stop Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price and Riley Leonard. Right. No team has.
Right.
So, like, my point is, for my prediction, I don't think Ohio State's going to be able to stop Dylan Sampson. I don't. Like, I think they have way too many issues on offense and with their identities, and I don't know how good their defense is going to play. Their rush defense has been the most consistent. But I think giving up 155 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns against Oregon, albeit it was at Autzen Stadium, I don't think then that means they stop Dylan Sampson. Like, I just don't. So I have Ohio State losing this one 23-17. I said it at the start of the playoff that I think that this could be the one upset of the round 1 games. So that's where I'm at.
Well, I'll just go ahead and go with my lazy cop out and say that I think that they do have a shot to shut down the run game. Because again,
it's funny how salty it got in here, considering Salty has made no comments.
I know. Where is Salty? What's he doing? Is he like shopping? Is he shopping with his wife today?
Got very crisp here at the end of the show. D-Troll Hunter said, it's like I've thought about chiming in a couple times, but you guys are ready to cut each other's heads off. No, go ahead. Go ahead. Make your prediction. Mine's at the end.
Chime in away.
I have nothing else at this point.
I think when I watch Ohio State's run defense this year, I think it has been a solid run defense all season. And I think one thing that has helped them with their run defense is the fact that they do jump on people. My issue comes down to if Tennessee can be balanced in this game, they have no shot at stopping Dylan Sampson. None. Because you have to commit resources. And that's what I'm saying is early in the game, you have to say we're stopping Dylan Sampson. That has to be your game plan if you're Ohio State. Can you do that? I don't know. Georgia tried to do that early and it didn't work. And I think he was like 80 yards at halftime. And then the second half of the game, they found answers and they were able to stop him. And I think it was 17-17 halftime game becomes a 31-17 Georgia win. That's really what it comes down to, because I do think Ohio State is good enough with a guy like Caleb Downs in the third level that they can start getting him into the box. You look at what they did to Indiana, for example, and completely made them one-dimensional. And then a lot of stuff they were trying to do to run stunts and run blitzes were getting to the quarterback, and then he didn't have time. I think this is a better offensive line than what Indiana has. And that's going to be the key, is Tennessee has a better offensive line than what Indiana has. And can you do that for 4 quarters? And that's going to be the challenge for Ohio State. And if they can do that and make Nico beat you, then I think it's going to be a much more competitive game. So I had a hard time with this one because I do think that they can slow Dylan Sampson down enough, but then it comes down to what can you do offensively? And at the end of the day, I think this is going to be a game where Tennessee's going to try to run the ball, and they're going to have success at times. At other times, they're not. Tennessee's a team that has really struggled to score points this season. If you look at the stretch after Kent State, they won 71-0. They scored 25, 14, 23, 24, 28, 33 against a crap Mississippi State team, 17 against Georgia, the 56 against UTEP, and then 36 against Vanderbilt. The question then becomes back to what I said early, Trev, after you talked about how Tennessee got here. Is that a sign of things to come for them in the postseason, or was that just sort of a Vanderbilt wearing down at the end of the year? That's what we don't know, right? And that's how a lot of these teams going into the playoff, end of the season, not great. And that's what's going to be in. Texas didn't end the season very well. Clemson didn't end the season very well. Yeah, they beat SMU, but they got beat by South Carolina a week before. Notre Dame won all their games, but probably their worst game the last 2 months was the last game of the regular season. Penn State ended the season with a loss. SMU ended the season with a loss. You know what I mean? Like Indiana beat Purdue, but then they played pretty poorly in the 2 games before that. There's not a lot of teams like in the first round that are just sky high, killing everybody, playing their best football coming in the postseason. Except not that Tennessee did it for a period of time, but that last 2.5 quarters against Vanderbilt, they started to look like the team they were in September. And that's the thing, is if we see that team in this game, then I think Tennessee wins, because here's the key, Trev, in this game. If Tennessee can have success scoring early and they make Ohio State say you have to go on the attack, you have to score with us, this is going to be a 31-27 game, I get a little bit nervous if I'm a Buckeye fan, because now it becomes a Will Howard has to make plays and you have to protect Will Howard. And that's what it kind of comes down to. And so I've been back and forth about this all week. I think what it's going to be for me is I don't trust either quarterback, but at least Will Howard has shown me that he has been able to play on a stage similar to this and have some good moments. Now, not at Ohio State per se, but I keep thinking back to the Big 12 title game a couple years ago when they beat TCU, and Will Howard played really good football down the stretch of that game. I think he's going to be able to make enough plays in this game to get them to 21. And I think that gets it done, because I have a lot more faith in the Ohio State defense than I think maybe some other people on this show do. I don't want to point any fingers at who I'm talking about. I'm just kidding.
I stand by my
I'm
opinion.
not going to crush you for it, because we had a similar conversation when we talked about SMU Clemson last week. So you look pretty good on that one. I just look at what they've done over the course of the year, and even in that Michigan game, they gave up 13 points. Right? I think this is going to be a low-scoring game, and if it's a low-scoring game, Ohio State wins. If this becomes a game, Trevor, where Tennessee gets past 20 and not on like final drive, punch one in when you're down 14 and get it, but if this is a game where you're getting into the third quarter and Tennessee gets over 20, then I think Tennessee wins this game. My prediction is 21-17 Ohio State. But if Tennessee starts moving the ball early, that's when Ohio State's screwed, because in my prediction, you don't need Will Howard to play well for 4 quarters. You need him to make a couple plays. And when you look at the matchup of their receivers against Tennessee secondary, I think Emeka, I think Jeremiah Smith, they're going to have a couple big plays in the pass game that set up scores that overcome the fact that they're not going to be able to run the ball on Tennessee, and they're not going to protect Will Howard for 4 quarters. I just don't think Tennessee can score more than 20 points only running the football on Ohio State. Because I think Dylan Sampson may get to 105, 110, 120, but it's going to be like 4.1 per carry, 3.9 per carry, and you're going to need Nico to go make a play. The thing that Will Howard has that Nico doesn't, Jeremiah Smith, Emeka Egbuka, Cardinal Tate, Brandon Ennis, and Travion Henderson out of the backfield. That, to me, is the difference. That's the one group that I think can go out there and handle this game. That's where I'm at. So I'm going 21-17 Buckeyes.
So you basically made the point that I would have boiled it all down to. We can talk about the 2 quarterbacks, and both of these teams have elite defenses, and that's, that to me is what makes it so hard to try to sort out who's going to come out on top in this, is because the defenses are very similar, just in terms of the stinginess of play and everything else. I do want to say, I do think it's ironic that Ohio State and Michigan, with this whole, we don't want to play night games in November. And now they get a playoff home game on December 21st at 8:00 at night. I do think that's pretty hilarious, honestly. But at the end of the day, I think this all comes down to, like Samson will get some yards. I do think Ohio State will at least be able to limit him. And I just feel like Tennessee is going to be the more one-dimensional team between the two offenses because of what you finished with there, Brian, because of the playmaking ability of Ohio State's wide receivers. Because Will Howard, whatever deficiencies he has, he's just got more talent around him offensively. And that goes, with the two running backs as well, because, I know that Samson obviously, is like much more the highlight guy and everything else, but Judkins and Henderson are a nice little tandem as well, so you don't have to rely on just one of them. And then with all the receiver talent that they've got, if Ryan Day actually rolls out a game plan and intends to use those skill guys, I think that's ultimately going to be the difference at the end of the day. And I've only got a 3-point difference in my prediction. I've got 24-17 Ohio State.
So 24-17. Trev, what was your final? Tennessee?
23-17.
So we all see this as a close, low-scoring game, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Here I'm going to say this about this prediction. If Ohio State wins this game and goes on any kind of run, they're going to have to make Travion Henderson a bigger part of their offense. I think that's the secret sauce for Ohio State. They have tried to ride Quinshon Judkins all season, and he is not that guy. It's like they think he's Dylan Sampson, Trevor. That's who Ohio State thinks he is. And he's not. He never had. He's a front runner. He piles up yards against bad teams. That's what he is. And that's what he's always been. Travion Henderson, to me, he's been banged up a lot of his career. He was so great as a freshman. He hasn't been healthy the last couple of years. I feel like getting him going is really the thing that they're going to have to do in this game. It really is. And he started to kind of get there going into the Michigan game. He had a big run against Indiana. He had some big runs against Northwestern. He had 6 for 85 against Northwestern. They're going to have to say him running and catching is the secret sauce for Ohio State to win this game and any future games. That's the thing, because I've seen Quinshon Judkins punk out and kind of curl up on short yardage situations. I still can't get that 4th and 1 against Oregon out of my head where he saw a linebacker in the hole and he goes like this and protects himself and takes the hit short of the sticks. Then I watched 205-pound Jeremiah Love in a similar situation run over a USC linebacker in a similar situation. Travion's going to be the key for them, in my opinion. Absolutely is going to be the key for them. And if they continue to use the backs the way they have all season, that could get them in trouble. But I just have a feeling that with 3 weeks rest, we're going to see a Travion Henderson game plan against Tennessee. Because Travion's also the guy, Trev, that can get out of the pocket. He can get outside and make plays. Doesn't have to do it between the trenches in an area where we all agree. Do we all agree? Ohio State's front offensive line is likely going to get whipped in this game. I mean, that's why we all have Ohio State scoring between 17 and 24 points, right?
Right.
It's going to have to be the playmakers on the perimeter, and I think Travion is part of that. I think that's a big part of that. That's the only way they can neutralize that Tennessee front four. Because if this is a traditional Ohio State game plan, drop back, sit in the pocket type of thing, I think they're going to get eaten up a little bit. For me, I look at Tennessee and I see that they struggled to move the ball and score points since October started. Yeah. And I just don't know that that's going to change in this game. That's what's going to be interesting. Is Nico going to be able to make some of those plays? Would you say, guys, this is the game where I have the least faith in both quarterbacks? I think Nico can eventually be great. I just think right now. I think Texas-Clemson is probably next.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's like Notre Dame, Indiana is probably the game where I have the most faith in the two quarterbacks unless they're just overwhelmed by a defense. I think Drew Aller has been a much better quarterback than people give him credit for this year. I think Kevin Jennings has been a dude. We talked about the Texas-Clemson game. This is the one game where I'm just like, I don't have faith in either one of these quarterbacks, to be completely honest with you. I do think Nico is eventually going to get there. He's just young. Will Howard's a fifth-year guy. This is kind of who he is.
Right.
This is why Oregon was like, or Kansas State was like, no, we're good. We'll go with Avery Johnson. Pass. We're good. Go to Ohio State. You know what I mean? And this is why Ohio State went after Cam Ward first. That's why they went after Riley Leonard first and then settled on Will Howard, because I just don't think he's that championship caliber quarterback. And I think that hurts them, especially when their offensive line is struggling. So it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting. So to recap, we all have Notre Dame.
Yes.
We all have Texas.
Yes.
Yep.
We all have Penn State.
Yep.
Yes.
And then 2 of us have Ohio State. 1 of us has Tennessee.
Yeah.
Last time we did one of these shows, Trevor, and you were 2-on-1, where 2 people picked against you. What happened?
Did he win?
Yeah.
I would not call him out like that if he was wrong. That would be such a jerk move to do. He got it right.
That would have been
That'd have been such a jerk move. Like, you're that mad that I don't think.
that would have been
No, Sean, when we did our championship predictions, Vince and I both picked SMU, and Trevor was like, I agree with everything you guys are saying about the matchup, but I don't think SMU is going to be ready for the moment. That's what it came down to. And that's exactly what happened. They weren't ready for the moment in the first half, and they fell behind so far that they had a valiant comeback, but it just wasn't enough. So he got it right.
Yep.
He got it right. I know our Buckeye fans are hoping you get it wrong in this one, Trev.
Well,
What
understandably so.
What happens if Penn State and Ohio State both get beat in the first round?
Oh my gosh.
What's the narrative that comes out of that one?
For Penn State, it's the same old. Like for Penn State, it's like, well, James Franklin just can't do it. For Ohio State, I mean, the call for Ryan Day's head will be about as loud as it ever would have been, because I've been saying it for the last couple of weeks is, the way that this team was put together and who you brought in and who you paid to keep and who you paid to forego the NFL draft, the expectations to me at a minimum were beat Michigan, win the Big Ten, make a run in the playoffs. And right now they're 0-2. And so if they go at home in the playoffs and lose to that team, because then you start looking at Ohio State. It's like, so what team is supposed to make this run? What team is supposed to beat Michigan? What team is supposed, like, this was it? Like, this was supposed to be it. And so, I think you could make the argument, Jeremiah Smith will be a year older and they'll have a system quarterback next year that's been familiar. But you're losing Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, 3 of your 4 members of your secondary. You're losing Quinshon. You're losing Travion. So it's going to be one of those where if they lose this first round game, where do you go? That's going to be a big question mark going into 25.
Sean, let me ask you this. What's the storyline for the Big Ten if that happens? Because the storyline, if they both win, is easy. This is the Big Ten's good. They have 3 of the 8, playoff teams. Because they would eliminate the SEC team.
Right.
One of the SEC teams, right? And I'm talking like traditional SEC teams, not like the newcomers like Oregon. Because, to me, if they both lose, the Big Ten has no team, no real Big Ten teams left. Yeah. And if Tennessee loses, then you only have one true traditional SEC team. What's the storyline for the Big Ten if they lose both of these games?
I think it's 50 weeks from now when we're having the conversations about who deserves to be in the Big Ten. You're going to hear, the Big Ten flopped on the, last year in the big stage. What your 2 of your, bell cow programs, Ohio State and Penn State, both lost their first games on their home fields. So, what's the Big Ten gets much less benefit of the doubt, a year from now when we're debating all these teams and who's deserving and everything else. And, Indiana's going to factor into that as well, because Indiana, look, we all think that Indiana is a good football team, but there are plenty of people nationally who do think that like an Alabama and or an Ole Miss or, a South Carolina should have been in this playoff with 3 losses over the 1-loss Indiana team because of the schedule that they played. I think that at least in year 1 of this playoff, there was still a compelling enough argument that you're in the Big Ten, you've only got 1 loss, regardless of what, schedule you played, and you were convincing enough in all of those wins that there should be a place for Indiana. And, at least right now, I believe that too. But if a year for, if these 2 teams get bounced, and then, depending on what happens in the Indiana Notre Dame game as well, then I think some of that is looked at next year, because, as this playoff goes forward as well, the Big Ten, still wants that, big piece of the pie along with the SEC to get these guaranteed bids and, everything that comes with it as well. So there's going to be a lot of pushback and wrangling and everything else from all these other conferences, say, look, Big Ten, stay in your place, stay in your lane over here if you lose these games, especially because it is Ohio State and Penn State.
We saw that happen in basketball. The Big Ten kept losing. Their highly ranked teams would constantly get upset for a long. I mean, have they still won a basketball championship since Michigan State's?
Michigan State's the last one, 1999, I believe, right?
Now Michigan won it last year, but that's got a bit of an asterisk with the cheating scandal and all those kind of things. That's going to make for an interesting conversation. I think they need to go 2-1 to still maintain the leverage that they think that they have to try to get some guaranteed bids. And then here's the counter argument, guys. What if the SEC struggles in the first 2 rounds like we've talked about? What if Texas gets upset by Ohio State beats Tennessee, Texas either struggles with Clemson or gets upset by Clemson, but even if Texas wins and then let's say Notre Dame beats Georgia, right? Like so to me, this is a very important couple weeks for the 2 power conferences that are trying to convince everyone they're so good that you have to give us 3 or 4 guaranteed bids. I think what happens these next couple weeks is either going to cement their argument. This is why we should have guaranteed bids, right? Indiana beat Notre Dame and Ohio State beat Tennessee, which is a kind of a wash. But then, Texas blows out Clemson and Purdue blows out SMU. And then Notre Dame, let's say Notre Dame even beats Indiana. Notre Dame gets beat by Georgia next week. And, Oregon beats Ohio State or Ohio State, whatever, because you're going to guarantee if Ohio State wins, you're guaranteed a Big Ten team in the semifinals. It's either going to be Ohio State or Oregon. I think these next 2, the storyline that we're not talking a lot about nationally is this one right here. Is what if the Big Ten and SEC teams don't dominate these next 2 weeks? What does that do for their argument for guaranteed bids here in the future college football playoff rankings? Exactly. Do you guys think it matters at all, or do you think it's just about money, or do you think that changes the narrative a little bit? Do you think that gives the Big 12 and the ACC and in Notre Dame the leverage to say this is why you shouldn't get guaranteed bids?
I think it should. You know what I mean? I think the fact that you bring up about money is going to just be a huge indicator, because at the end of the day, like, that is kind of the end all be all. What draws in money? Ohio State. What draws in money? Texas and Georgia. And, but I think it will put the committee in an interesting spot, and it'll put like the rest of college, like the college football nation on alert of, hey, we can't just assume that the Big Ten and the SEC are home to just the best football. You know what I mean? Because it's like, depending on what happens with this playoff, it's a small sample size because I think it'll be like what happens in more college football playoffs, because the caveat will be for everybody this year. Well, it's new for everybody this year. So,
Mm-hmm.
But I think if the Big Ten and the SEC, first of all, to answer your first question, if the Big Ten doesn't do well, the SEC is going to get really loud.
Yes.
And then vice versa. If the SEC doesn't do well in the playoff, then the Big Ten's going to be like, see, we do have the best conference.
Right.
Now, if both struggle, like you have situations where Notre Dame goes and beats IU and Georgia, a Big Ten and an SEC team. You have Clemson pull off the upset against Texas. You have SMU upset Penn State, something like that.
Or Boise does, right.
Then it's going to be a situation of like, now what leg do you have to stand on?
Right.
SEC and Big Ten.
Other than just look at our TV numbers.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only argument you have for a championship.
Really interesting.
For a championship. Like, that's not a convincing argument. I think you nailed it, Trevor, is if one of the leagues does better than the other, that league is going to get really talkative.
Oh, yeah.
Towards that. Because both of those leagues think that they're the only 2 leagues that exist.
Exactly.
I mean, that's it. And they're just going to kind of bark at that league. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be like, and what does it say for the ACC if they both pull off, which is highly unlikely, because I don't think Clemson has a chance in that game. I really don't, guys. I don't. But again, it just kind of goes to show, guys, like, what if SMU upsets Penn State and beats Boise? Now all of a sudden it's like I do think this stuff, because we're so close to the new contract and the expansion to 14, I do think the outcome of this year's game could be fuel for arguments to be had about, do those leagues really deserve those bids? And if they dominate, if Penn State beats SMU and Notre and Indiana, Notre Dame loses to Georgia next week or loses to Indiana this week, if Clemson gets blown out like we think, that could end up being the 2 only blowouts could be Texas blows out Clemson, blows out Arizona State. And now, so you know what I mean? Like, those things could happen. And that's what's going to make, I think that adds a little extra something to these playoffs that beyond just the matchups of these teams that we're talking about. I just wanted to bring that up before we wrap up.
Yeah,
which I gave us the kiss of death when we were doing our pregame talk. I said, we're not going to come close to getting to 3 hours, guys.
The second
So
you said that,
here we are.
I was like, no
every
way,
time
dude.
I do that, Trevor,
No
every
way.
time.
Army
guys
Navy's on. Army Navy's on.
Yes. So my bad on that jinx, that kiss of death I gave us before we started. Yeah.
No, you're good. It was fun. It was fun. It was a good show.
Good stuff. It's the first time I've done a show with both of you guys.
Yeah,
together,
it's good.
so
Yeah,
it's good.
Yeah,
it's good. You have to learn to just interject. You got to jump right in there, Sean.
That's all right. You guys got your flow, so.
Let's roll. So you want to take us out of here, Sean? So we go watch some football?
I don't know what your typical wrap
hit the
up
like,
is.
hit the subscribe, do all
hit
that
the like
kind of
button,
stuff.
subscribe to us, on
Trev,
your
show them how
podcast
it's done.
platform.
Show 'em
Go
how it's
ahead,
done,
Trevor.
Trev.
Come on, you take us into this.
Well, thank you guys for being with us for the better half of 3 hours. Shout out to Brian for the kiss of death. But we got the Army. we got the Army Navy game. We have a lot of fun playoff games coming up next week, guys. So make sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. We have a super chat that we have to get to from the War of 1812 Stop Motions. Thank you for the super chat.
Real quick, there's an offensive lineman supposed to commit on New Year's Eve, Ben Nichols. He's the next potential commitment. Beyond that, we don't predict commitments, but he's going to decide between Notre Dame and several others. And Trevor is absolutely not job hunting because that's all part of the fun.
Yeah.
He doesn't always have to agree with me. Doesn't have to think my opinions are the best. That's part of the fun of having it. And just like the debate I had with Bill Bender, that's the fun part.
Yeah.
Right. Now I could have gone without him saying that my opinion was lazy, but I'm totally kidding. I'm totally kidding, Trev. But no, guys, that's what we like to do here. We like to talk ball. We like to go back and forth. It's even better when we're not always on the same page. That's what makes it fun. That's what makes it fun.
I was about to say, as much as I'm sure all of you would like to listen to 3 hours of me going 100%. Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself. Hit the nail on the head, Brian. I have a lot of those in my back pocket just ready to go. I know I say it a lot, but in all seriousness, no, it's a lot of fun, man. And you can continue to catch up with all the fun if you subscribe on the message boards at boards.irishbreakdown.com. So for Sean Stiers, for Brian Driscoll, I'm Trevor Trowbridge. We'll see you back here next time on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.